Welcome back to Grimhammer. Today's video we have the Oath Broken, which is essentially the Chaos version of the Deathwatch. If you'd like to support the channel, be sure to subscribe, like, and comment. Now let's get into the video.
The macro hulk drifted in the eye of terror like the carcass of a slain deity, a gutted titan of steel and stone left to rot in the mad tides of the warp. It was not a single ship. It was a continent of dead war machines welded into a slow-moving mountain, its flanks made of shattered battle barges, torn starforts, and broken god engines. Cathedral prows jutted at impossible angles, their once proud aquilae hammered flat and overlaid with 8-pointed stars. Titan corpses lay shackled along its spine, their hollowed reactors burning with sickly witchlight, their dead weapon limbs shackled and repurposed as gun decks. Whole void stations were bolted to its underside like tumors, vents and docking moors spewing out rust and ash and sparks of demonic flame. The scrapyard of gods, the legionaries called it. The slaves did not call it anything. They were too busy screaming. Chain gangs of mortal serfs and press-ganged heretics staggered across the docking gantries, dragging the weight of their masters behind them. Broken chaos. Astartes came in their thousands, bound in coils of chain, held in place by maglocks and hex brands. They moved like armored statues being towed to a place of burial, black and gold and rust all smeared with the same dried blood. Some had no legs, their stumps bolted to grav sleds. Some were missing both arms, their shoulders fused into plates of riveted ceramite. Others had half their faces gone, helm lenses cracked and dark, cymbal studs torn away so that only broken holes remained where once there had been pride. Above them, in the void around the hulk, the Black Legion's armada swam. Warships by the tens of thousands stalked the darkness in slow procession. Murder-class cruisers and ancient Legion battle barges burned through the void like black comets, their hulls scarred by 10,000 battles. Escort squadrons prowled between them, flanked by demon engines that glided on wings torn from realities that no sane mind would name. Planet-killer platforms drifted like iron moons, their cyclopean weapons shuttered for now, their machine spirits dreaming of continents turned to glass. The macro hulk sat at the armada's heart, a rusted throne surrounded by blades. Inside, in the judgment hall, failure knelt before its king. The hall had once been a mechanicum chapel, if the remnants of cog and skull worked into the walls could be believed. Now, the iconography was strangled in chains of brass and iron, every cog studded with eyes that wept molten metal, every skull replaced with snarling demonic visages. The floor was a plate of magnetized steel laid over the petrified bones of some titanic void creature. The ceiling was the gutted underside of a cruiser hull, its mural of the Great Crusade melted into a relief of figures writhing in chains. At the far end rose a throne built from broken relics of the Imperium. Bent aquila wings, shattered statues of the Emperor, torn banners from fallen chapters, each nailed or welded into a jagged mountain of blasphemy. Upon that throne sat Abaddon the Despoiler. The Warmaster was stillness in the storm. Black warplate devoured the light, trimmed in the same rude gold as the rest of his legion, but borne with a weight that made it seem like armor worn by the concept of war itself. Fresh trophy helms rattled upon his spiked racks, some still leaking amniotic fluids, others torn from Xenos whose names had already been forgotten. His braid of pale hair lay across one shoulder like a flayed serpent. Upon his right hand rested the talon of Horus, its great claws flexing idly, its surface alive with crawling runes that looked like they were trying to escape. He did not need to shout. The warp itself seemed to hush when he spoke. The failures waited on their knees, while the champion of the Black Legion paced before them, reading from a strip of flayed human hide inscribed with their sins. Legionary crowned of the former sons of Horus, the champion said, his helm vox carrying the words through the immense chamber. You broke formation on Vraxus to pursue personal glory. You led your claw into a minefield laid by mortal guardsmen. When your brothers died, you fled. Crand bowed his shattered helm, the sea green of his ancient legion still visible beneath the black, where the newer paint had flaked away. "War Master," he said, servos whining as he tried to straighten. "Grant me another chance. I will drown that world in its own blood, I swear it." A silence like a held breath. Abaddon's gaze never left him. It did not need to. The weight of it pressed through armor and bone and into the cowering core of the traitor's soul. "You had a chance," the War Master said at last, voice a low, grinding thunder. "You broke it, like you broke your oath." The talon flexed once. The air cracked. For a heartbeat, Crand was still kneeling. The next, his torso was a shredded ruin hanging in the air. Armor, torn open like wet parchment, red and black mist spraying out in a wide cone. His head pinwheeled away, bouncing once upon the deck before coming to rest face up, helm torn open, a single organic eye still blinking in confusion. The serfs were quick. They scuttled in with hooked chains and dragged the pieces away before the blood finished steaming. "Legionary Crand," the champion repeated, striking a line through the flayed parchment with the knife of his gauntlet. "Judged. Executed." Abaddon's talon dripped, then burned the gore away in a hiss of warp fire. The despoiler made a small, dismissive gesture. Next. A new figure was shoved forward by the chains. He fell to both knees in a clatter of armor and mangled bionics, catching himself with what remained of his hands. Voroth Chiron's fingers were gone. The stumps of his wrists ended in jagged lumps of bone and metal where crude battlefield augmetics had been torn free. The blue and white of his old legion showed through his blackened armor, but the once proud heraldry of the World Eaters was scraped and gouged until only hints remained, like old scars under fresh wounds. His helm had been removed, exposing a face that looked carved from old scars. His scalp was a map of ritual cuts and faded brass studs bearing a god's broken rune. His teeth were all wrong. Too many, too sharp, ground down by a life spent biting through flesh. "Voroth Chiron," the champion said, "once of the 12th Legion, on the shrine moon of Karvost, you were ordered to hold the northern breach. Instead, you pursued slaughter into the enemy rear. Your bloodlust drew you away from your duty. The breach fell. 1,000 of our mortal followers were butchered." Voroth's laugh was a raw gargle. 1,000 mortals, he said. "Good. They died for something worth dying for. Better than rotting as serfs." The champion's boot crashed into the side of his head, snapping his jaw sideways and slamming him to the floor. "Silence," the War Master said. Vorath coughed blood, then forced himself upright. He met Abaddon's gaze with eyes still bright under the ruin. "War Master," he rasped, "kill me or chain me. I will not beg." Abaddon regarded him for a long moment. "Your god has no more time for you," he said. The words struck harder than any blow. Vorath's laugh finally died. "Your limbs are gone," Abaddon went on. "Your patron has ceased mending you. You are beneath its notice now, beneath mine, but not without use." He raised the talon, but this time the claws did not fall. Instead, he gestured to the side of the throne. Shadows moved. From behind the throne stepped a tall figure in rune-crusted armor the color of spilled wine. His helm was a smooth, featureless mask carved with a single slit of warp-lit crystal where the eyes should have been. Where his legs should have been, there was only a slick coil of braided cables and living flesh, like the tail of some metallic serpent. The mass writhed and flexed, bearing his upper body above the deck without any visible effort. "Malithzar," Abaddon said, "sorcerer of the damned Thousand Suns. You asked for instruments. Here they are." The Psyker inclined his masked head. Pale witchfire crawled over his staff, each flicker the echo of some wordless scream. "I will break them," he said, his voice a whisper that carried like smoke. "I will bind them. Their oaths will be iron in their veins." Abaddon's gaze dropped back to Vorath. "You will not die today," the War Master said. "You will be taken, stripped, remade. You will fight until nothing is left that can hold a blade. You will exist only to spend your failure usefully." Vorath's lips peeled back from his broken teeth. "That sounds," he said, "like a good death." Abaddon ignored him, raising his talon again. "Let all here hear this," the despoiler called, his voice growing, filling the hall until it seemed to come from the walls, the floor, the air. "These are oath-broken. They are not forgiven. They are not absolved. They are not worthy of the gods' gifts. They are mine. They will be my warning to every warlord and every legionary who thinks that failure can be hidden in the warp's shadow." The champion dragged Vorath away by the chains around his throat. Others took his place. A line of shattered giants, each presented to the throne and weighed upon invisible scales. Some were cast down into the pits that yawned on either side of the hall, their screams trailing away into the howls of whatever waited below. Others were marked for the same slow damnation as Vorath. One of them was already on his knees when his name was spoken. "Sergeant Rauk Sable," the champion read. "Black Legion, 8th Claw. You held the breach on Halleck's Prime until the enemy brought their artillery to bear. You requested extraction. You did not receive it. You fell back to secondary positions against orders. The world was lost. The War Master's banner burned in imperial flame." Rauk said nothing. His helm was on, but there were no optics. The glass lenses were shattered, empty hollows lined with tiny data spikes. No eyes looked out. His blindness came from inside. The sockets within the helm were packed with scar tissue and burned augmetic ports. The little that remained of his organic eyes had been melted long ago by witchfire, and the machine replacements ripped out in punishment. He saw only data now, the bone-deep throbbing of distant engines, the thrum of coiled warp power, the static hum of Vox traffic, all translated by the implants threaded through his skull. Even kneeling, he stood taller than any mortal in the hall. "War Master," he said, his voice a rough growl. "I did not retreat from fear. My position was ash. My brothers were dead. There was nothing left to hold with." Abaddon's talon flexed. "You lost my banner," the despoiler said. "You lost my world. What you did or did not fear is beneath my regard." Rauk bowed his head. "Then kill me," he said. "Let the ledger close." "No," Abaddon replied. The word fell like a gavel. "You are oath-broken. You will serve as the others will serve, but you will carry a particular shame. You will lead them." Rauk stilled. "Lead," he repeated as if tasting a poison. "Lead whom?" Abaddon rose, the throne creaking under the weight of his armor. "Look around you, Sergeant," he said. Rauk's dead sockets could not see, but his implants could feel. He opened himself to the data streams running through the hall, the biometric feeds from the shackled traitors, the machine spirits of their armor broadcasting their damage, their kill tallies, their legion markings. The information flooded into his mind like cold light. He saw them, 1,000 broken warriors, exiles from every traitor legion. The iron and hazard stripe of siege masters cracked and patched with scrap metal, crude heavy weapons bolted straight into ruined shoulders. The purple and gold of decadent killers, their faces shattered and disguised behind nailed-on masks. The midnight and lightning sigils of the Terror Legion, wings torn away, jump packs removed, their mutilated bodies reduced to scarred torsos and ragged cloaks of flayed skin. No longer champions, no longer chosen, just wreckage still capable of killing. "I see them," Rauk said quietly. "You will be their Blackwatch captain," Abaddon said, a mockery of the loyalist fools who call themselves Deathwatch. They send their finest to hunt the alien in the name of their corpse god. I will send my broken to hunt anything I choose, as far into the fire as I desire. You will hold them together. You will spend them. You will die among them one day. Until then, you live to remind every legionary what awaits if they fail me. The word Deathwatch, tasted of ash on Rauk's tongue. He had fought them once, long ago, when the galaxy still pretended at order. The memory of sleek black armor and silver pauldrons, of purity seals fluttering in the wind of drop pod descent, rose unbidden. They had been the Emperor's chosen hunters, scions of 100 chapters, each a perfect killer. He looked at the oath broken again. In them, he saw no perfection, only stubborn, ugly survival. No god had mended their wounds. No dark blessing had regrown their limbs. They had crawled away from blast craters and burning tanks and the teeth of alien beasts, dragging half-chewed bodies, and when no one came to help, they had hammered blades onto their stumps and stolen Xeno's limbs and wired scrap augmetics into ragged flesh until they could stand and kill again. There was a cruelty in that which no sane mind could have designed. Chaos did not always destroy its failures. Sometimes it made them get back up. "Do you understand, Rauk Sable?" the War Master asked. Rauk bowed his head lower. "I understand," he said. "I do not offer you redemption," Abaddon went on. "Do not mistake this. The gods will not look upon you with favor again. Your gene brothers will not call you to their war councils. You are not forgiven, but you will be useful. And that is more than most failures earn." He turned slightly, looking past the kneeling sergeant to the assembled wrecks. "Hear me," the despoiler said, and the hall vibrated with the force of his words. "You are the oath broken. You failed me. You failed yourselves. You failed the gods. And yet you still draw breath. That is the only reason you still exist. I will throw you where the war burns hottest, into alien swarms, into Imperial fortress worlds, into the throats of rival warlords. You will break sieges that have stood for centuries, or you will be ground into the foundations. You will slaughter until your limbs give out. Then you will crawl and bite and claw until there is nothing left of you but a smear on some forgotten rock." His talon clenched, gouging furrows into the arm of his throne. "This is your oath now. Die usefully, or die screaming in the dark, where no one will ever remember your name." A murmur ran through the hall. Not protest, not even acceptance. Just the low growl of ruined warriors for whom the choice between two deaths was hardly a choice at all. Malith Zar drifted forward on his writhing tail, staff crackling softly. Invisible chains of thought extended from him, probing, looping, sinking barbs of witchlight into every oath-broken vox channel, every node of their armor, the raw bleeding edges of their souls. Oaths were spoken in a tongue that tasted like hot metal. Names were carved into the warp and then crossed through. New designations burned themselves into existence. Rauk felt shackles close around his mind, hex runes sinking into the scars of his old vows. Malith's presence brushed his thoughts, cold and serpent smooth. "I will hold you," the sorcerer murmured, audible only in the private spaces of Rauk's skull. "If you stray, the chains tighten. If you flee, they break your mind. If you betray, they burn you from the inside out. Lead them well, Blackwatch Captain. Not for your sake, for mine. If you collapse, I am dragged down with you." "Good," Rauk replied, teeth bared behind his helm. "Then at least one of us has something to lose." The sorcerer's laughter was a dry rustle of parchment. Beyond the judgment hall, the macro hulk shuddered. Great engines coughed and howled into life as tugs and demon craft latched on, hauling the scrapyard of gods into a new vector. The armada adjusted, like a school of predators smelling blood in the water. On the outer hull, the viewports of the countless observation decks filled with the sight of the eyes roiling storms, drawing back to reveal the shadow of the galaxy beyond. A subsector stood in their path, a cluster of rebellious worlds that had dared to hold against the War Master's latest crusade. Hive cities still burned with imperial banners. Orbital fortresses still carried the Aquila intact. Fleets of the Corpse Emperor still bled and yet held the line. Abaddon rose from his throne and turned away, already thinking of the next war. "Take the oath broken to the forges," he commanded. "Strip them, rearm them. When the fleet translates, They will spear the weakest vein in that resisting subsector and tear it open. If they die to the last warrior, so be it. If they live, it means the Imperium suffered more than I expected. He glanced back, just once, at the kneeling line of ruined giants. Either way, the War Master said, almost to himself, their debt begins to be paid. The macro hulk drifted on, the armada following in its wake like a swarm of steel locusts. In its depths, the broken were dragged away to the cutting halls, and the graft vaults, to have chain, blades hammered into bone, and alien limbs sutured into torn sockets. They bled and screamed and laughed and cursed as their bodies were remade into instruments of slaughter. Broken in body, yes, hatred did not break so easily. The Forge World waited below the macro hulk like an open wound. Through the armored view slits of the drop cradles, Rauk Sable felt its presence before he heard the machine hymns. His sight was gone, burned out and torn away, but the implants buried in his skull translated the storm of Vox and data into a different kind of vision. He tasted the roar of continent-sized furnaces as a metallic tang on his tongue. He heard the whine of Factorum engines as pressure behind his broken eyes. The whole demon world was a grinding, howling machine spirit, hungry for flesh and iron. Descent clamps shuddered. Chains groaned. The cages that held the Oathbroken rattled like bone boxes as they fell. They were packed shoulder to shoulder, plate grating against plate, chain bindings rattling with every jolt. Atmospheric friction turned the drop line into a burning scar that split the smog of the lower hemisphere. Void-hardened hulls screamed as demonic turbulence clawed at them, trying to tear the macro hulk's gifts back into the sky. Someone vomited blood inside his helm. Someone else laughed, a low, broken sound that came from a throat too cracked to carry joy. Vorath Chiron stood pressed against the far wall of the cage, his torso braced by iron struts that kept him upright. His new limbs hung at his sides, heavy and eager. They were not true arms. They were lengths of motorized steel ending in crude chain blade casings, teeth resting idle for now. The tech priests of the Dark Mechanicum had bolted them straight into his ruined shoulder joints, feeding power cables down into his spine, slaving the engines to the nerve bundles that remained. They had not done this out of mercy. They had done it because it pleased them to make him useful. Again, Vorath flexed one stump. The chain housing twitched and purred against his flank, teeth scraping together in anticipation. Phantom pains crawled through the ghost of his old flesh, the memory of real fingers that would never return. He snarled under his breath and drowned that memory in the promise of future cuts. "Do you feel it, World Eater?" came Malithzar's voice, calm and dry, from the hooded figure clamped beside him. The sorcerer's serpentine lower body was wrapped tightly in a coil of cabling to keep him stable for descent. Witchfire flickered behind the eye slit of his helm. His staff was pinned at an angle by restraining bolts, runes along its haft sullen and dark for now. "Feel what?" Vorath rasped. "The Forge," Malith said. "It sings for you, for all of you. It smells your blood and it is eager." Vorath bared his teeth. "Let it be eager," he said. "I am thirsty." The cages slammed into the landing cradles hard enough to buckle. Mortals! Shock absorbers screamed. Magnetic clamps bit into their hulls. With a series of clanging locks, the cage's frontal plates dropped away like descending portcullises. Heat and light hit them like a blow. The mustering pits were cathedral vast caverns choked with smoke and flame. Rivers of molten metal poured in channels the width of city streets, casting an orange glow over scaffolds and gantries that hung in the air like spider webs. Chains thick as hab blocks swung from the darkness above, suspending unfinished demon engines that twitched and howled as living metal grew over their frames. Tech adepts in crimson and rust marched along the walkways, their voices a mechanical drone as they intoned liturgies of binding to machine spirits that were only half sane. At ground level, where the landing cradles had slammed down, the air was thick with cinder dust and the stink of promethium. Assemblies of Chaos Space Marines in full war panoply stood watching the cages open, They wore the black and gold of the Black Legion, and their laughter rolled like thunder. "Look!" one of them voxed, his voice carried over external amplifiers. "They found the scrap pile." "Maimed dogs," another said with broad amusement. "The War Master's kennel grows crowded." "They should have finished them," a third added. "Clean bolt rounds, a neat ledger. This is untidy." Rauk Sable walked out of his cage into their jeers. His armor had been stripped and rebuilt in the cutting halls aboard the Macro Hulk. The black and rude gold of the Black Legion still formed the base, but the plates were patched with all manner of scavenged ceramite. His left pauldron bore a fragment of old sea green, its original Legion marking ground off but not entirely erased. His right greave showed a slice of hazard striping stolen from some Iron Warrior's corpse. Amputated augmetic sockets had been sealed with jagged plates of lapis inlaid iron, not for beauty, but because that was the metal to hand when the forged servitors reached him. His helm lenses were still dark hollows, but above them a new sigil had been hammered into the brow. It was a variation of the 8-pointed star, its arms twisted inward as though strangling themselves, the central eye scarred out, the mark of the oath broken. Around him, his new command shambled out. They were not a coherent legion. They had once been many things. Now they shared only ugliness and a uniform lack of divine favor. One warrior's right arm was a haunch of thick-scaled Xenos flesh, grafted straight into his shoulder with crude staples and necrotic welds, fingers ending in black claws that flexed uneasily in the forge heat. Another had lost both hands and had paired hook blades hammered into his wrists, their edges ragged but keen. A third walked on a single massive bionic leg, the other replaced by a crude piston limb that hissed and spat oil with each step, throwing him into a permanent, half limp that he compensated for with the easy balance of long practice. Their armor was black, gold, and that same repeated lapis shade, but everything else was chaos. Fractured studs, mismatched gorgets, old chapter badges half melted and inverted into 8-pointed parodies. Helmets were cut away to fit scarred faces. Chest plates bulged where redundant organs had swollen beneath, unblessed but still functional. Each warrior was a walking reliquary of mutilation, a shrine to stubborn endurance in the absence of a god's smile. Warbands of intact Black Legionaries watched them pass. "Remember their faces," one war leader voxed to his claw, loud enough that the Oathbroken's external receivers picked it up. "You see Rauk Sable limping through your lines. You know what awaits you if you try to hide your failures." Rauk did not turn his blind helm toward the speaker. He did not need to. His augmetics tagged the signature, stored it like any other threat. He walked on, the chains at his wrists rattling with each step, his back straight. Malith Zar rode beside him, his serpentine tail gliding over the steel grating with sinuous ease, too proud to slither. Vorath moved to the other side, his chain arms hanging idle for now, cloak of flayed skin dragging through the ash. At the far end of the mustering pits, an altar of twisted iron rose from the deck. Spikes protruded from it at all angles, each bearing skulls, helmets, or torn banners. In front of that altar stood a figure in armor the color of dried blood, covered in scripture scars. The Dark Apostle's voice was a sermon made manifest. "Come forward, Oath Broken," he called, vox booming. "Come kneel and receive what you have earned." Rauk halted a few paces away, then went down on one knee, not in worship, but because that was the ritual, and ritual was a kind of weapon. Behind him, the 1,000 ruined Marines of the Oathbroken followed suit, armor clanging as they pressed their mangled forms into temporary humility. The Apostle raised a brand from the brazier at his side. Its tip glowed white hot, runes along its length, writhing like worms in molten metal. A demon's distorted face could be seen for a moment in the flickers before heat burned the image away. "This is the sigil of your shame," the Apostle said with relish. "You will bear it upon your plate, upon your very souls. Those who command in the Black Legion will feel its echo. If you turn your teeth upon your masters, if you seek to flee, if you think to claim some pitiful sovereignty, they will know, and they will crush you. He gestured to Rauk. "Watch, Captain," he said. The title turned inside out with mockery and dark humor. "Step forward." Rauk rose. His footfalls rang against the deck as he approached the altar. Heat from the brand washed over his helm, searing at the fresh metal worked into his brow. "Name yourself," the apostle commanded. "Rauk Sable," he replied. "Sergeant of the Black Legion, oath broken." The apostle's chuckle was like grinding gears. "You are wrong," he said. "You are no longer sergeant. You are Black Watch Captain. You lead this pack. You die with them, not for them. Remember that distinction." He pressed the brand to Rauk's chest plate, directly over his primary heart. Agony flared. For an instant, Rauk's world was nothing but white fire and the stink of his own cooking flesh, even through plate and fiber bundle. Then the pain sank deeper, past ceramite and plasteel, through the bone and into the meat, through the meat and into the soul. He felt the brand's rune take root in the warp echo of him, fusing with Malith Zar's already braided chains. Behind the apostle, somewhere in the depths of space, higher lords of the Black Legion felt a new spark appear on their mental ledgers, a beacon of shame, ready to be snuffed out at a thought. The brand lifted, leaving a charred eight-pointed scar, its arms pointing inward as if clawing towards the center. "Rise, Black Watch Captain," the apostle said. "Lead your broken." Rauk stood. The burned sigil pulsed in time with his heart's. He turned away from the altar, back toward the sea of mutilated armor and scavenged limbs. "Cohorts," he voxed, voice carried on encoded channels that rang in every helm. "Stand and be named." Shapes moved in the crowd. To his left, a knot of warriors whose black and gold plate was heavy with hazard stripes and chevrons slammed their iron-shod boots in unison. Their armor was more scar than metal, held together by rivets and exposed bracing. Where their arms had been shorn away in past bombardments, thick bionic assemblies had been bolted on. Some ended in multi-barreled stub cannons, others in grav-fed ammunition hoppers feeding into underslung heavy bolters. One bore a crude siege drill grafted straight into the elbow joint, its head still stained with rock dust and human marrow. "Red iron," Rauk said. "Maimed of the Iron Warriors. You punch holes." Laughter came back across the Vox, harsh and metallic. To his right, slender figures moved with feline grace despite missing fingers and toes. Their armor was less battered, but the damage that had been done to them was delicate rather than crude. Many had their faces hidden behind masks of exquisite, horrific craftsmanship, symbols of some long-lost devotion to sensation. The masks were nailed into the flesh beneath. Where their lips had once been, only blood-crusted edges showed around the rivets. "Gilded ruin," Rauk said. "Cast-offs of the Emperor's bastards. You excel at close work." Soft chuckles answered, like broken glass poured over silk. At the rear, a cluster of shadows detached from the crowd. They wore ragged cloaks of skin and leather, some adorned with flayed faces drawn into screaming expressions. The midnight blue of their original legion peeked through beneath, the black lightning motifs fragmented by crude patching. A wing stump here, a torn jump pack mount there, showed what they had once been. Their Vox grills were modified into rasping speakers, and the totems they carried bore skulls arranged in patterns designed to twist the instinctive senses. "Knight's wound," Rauk said. "Failsons of the night. You terrify whatever you can." In answer, one of them activated a set of low-frequency emitters. The air shivered. Mortal serfs in the shadows of the pits dropped tools and clutched at their chests, sudden animal panic washing through them. Even some of the intact Black Legionaries shifted their stance, gauntlets clenching as old fear responses flickered in half-forgotten parts of their gene-wrought minds. Roke let the currents of data run through him. Cohorts, broken down and rebuilt into something like kill teams. Not brothers, but packs. Not chosen, but chained. The Warmaster's intent was clear. The Imperium had its Deathwatch, the proud chamber militant of the Ordo Xenos, crafted from the finest gene sons of 1,000 chapters. when the alien manifested in numbers too great for common warriors, when exotic horrors needed specialized death, the Inquisition called upon that black-armored brotherhood and knew that somewhere in that thin black line of fire would be the right weapon. Abaddon had no patience for such finery. To him, the Oathbroken were not elite so much as expendable specialists. He could hurl them against orc hordes, Tyranid hive fleets, Eldar craftworlds, even rival warlords within the Eye, and if they triumphed, some useful enemy had been depleted. If they perished, the galaxy would lose nothing of value in his long accounting. They were not given the honor of choosing their battlefields. They were not sworn to a noble vigil. They went where others balked only because they were told to, because the alternative was an anonymous execution on some forgotten deck, and because, despite everything, they wanted to fight. Far away, across gulfs of void that could only be half measured even by the navigator's art, an Inquisitor read the echoes of such decisions in the blood of his own war zones. Lord Halbrecht of the Ordo Xenos sat hunched in his command lectern, clothed in worn carapace and a long coat of flayed rebel skin, eyes fixed on the dancing hololith before him. Around him, the bridge of his strike cruiser hummed with the quiet efficiency of a well-drilled crew. Auspex officers watched their scopes. Vox adepts whispered Binharic prayers into the channels. On the hololith, a dozen replayed engagements flickered in sequence. They showed grainy images drawn from helmet cams and orbital Auspex logs. Gulfs of darkness swarming with orc war engines and Tyranid bioforms filled the display. Two alien tides slamming together in an endless idiot war over some blighted moon. Into that storm, a thin line of black and gold had fallen from the heavens. Halbrecht watched them batter their way through the overlapping kill zones of both Xenos breeds. He saw hulking figures with mismatched armor tear apart orc knobs with chain blades bolted to the ragged stumps of arms, then pivot in the same breath to put bolter rounds into the bulging eyes of a towering Carnifex. He watched a limping giant plant melt charges with surgical precision, not caring that the blast would engulf hundreds of nearby human cultists along with the monsters. He saw a figure in a ragged cloak call out litanies that twisted the audio channels, making even the calm Mechanicus techs on the bridge flinch at the echoes. Deathwatch, one of Halbrecht's interrogators muttered, fists clenched. They must be. Who else fights like that, in such numbers, against such foes? Halbrecht tapped commands into his lectern. Target markers bloomed around the black and gold warriors, magnifying the image until individual battle scars could be seen on their armor. The colors were wrong for the Deathwatch. The sigils were wrong. The crude patching spoke of desperation rather than pride. The way they treated human life, even heretic life, as nothing more than convenient meat was wrong. But the modus operandi was too similar to ignore. Small teams, strangling pressure points in battles of impossible scale, striking where they could hurt most. Not Deathwatch, Halbrecht said slowly. Something worse. Something new. The logs cut off in a flare of static as the Auspex ship that had recorded them was torn apart by a spread of macro cannon shells. Halbrecht sat in silence for a moment longer, considering. Then he turned away, cloak whispering against the Vox lines. Flag those signatures, he told his adepts. If that crippled warband appears again, I want to know. The alien breeds us nightmares every decade. I have no intention of being surprised by a traitor mirror of our own chamber militant. On the Demon Forge world, the Oath, broken knelt in a ring around Malith Zar. The sorcerer floated above the deck, tail coiled, staff planted before him like a banner pole. Around him, tech adepts had erected a circle of rusted pylons inscribed with warp script. Between the pylons hung chains of bone and cabling, on which were threaded strips of tanned skin bearing names in 1,000 different scripts. Some of those names were already scorched through, leaving only shadows. This is the ledger of your oaths, Malith said. His voice carried on a psychic undertone that made even hardened legionaries feel as if invisible fingers were tracing the scars inside their skulls. When you first swore yourselves to your legions, to Horus, to the Warmaster and the gods, your names were burned into the warp. Some have been crossed out. Some were never written at all. He raised his staff. Witchfire crawled along its length, spilling out into the air. I offer you this, he went on. Not forgiveness, not absolution, but a shape to your damnation. 3 great hunts, 3 war zones, 3 opportunities to spend yourselves to the last drop. If you survive them and stand before Abaddon again, he may choose to look on you. He may choose to speak. He let the word hang there, heavy as a guillotine. May. Hope was a cruel thing. It burned in the chests of even these ruinous wrecks when he dangled it in front of them. Rauk felt the ripple of it through the voxnet, a subtle tightening of focus, a sharpening of breath. Vorath's chain blades twitched, carving tiny trenches in the deck. Swear, Malith commanded. One by one, in voices raw and grinding, the Oathbroken recited the oaths they had once sworn. Oaths to long-dead Primarchs. Oaths to Legion symbols that no longer flew anywhere in real space. Oaths to chaos itself, spoiling for freedom. Then Malith made them say them again. He twisted the words, forcing each warrior to replace titles of honor with admissions of failure. No longer sons, but remnants. No longer chosen, but spent. They swore to serve not as brothers, but as ammunition. They bound themselves to Rauk's command by chains that acknowledged he was no more worthy than they, just as trapped. With each oath, the strips of skin on the chains ignited in cold fire, letters scorched deeper, names rewritten as broken echoes of what they had been. Rauk spoke last. I, Rauk Sable, he said, voice low but clear. Once sergeant of the Black Legion, now Black Watch captain of the Oathbroken, swear by my gene seed and the scars of my failures to lead these wrecks until we are ground to dust. I swear to the Warmaster to die only when he has no more use for me. I swear to the gods that if they will not have me, I will spite their neglect by killing in their name until my hands fall off. Malith's laugh was a hiss. So bound, the sorcerer said. So lesser, so useful. He slammed his staff against the deck. The pylons flared. A ring of psychic force rolled outward, slamming through armor and bone and into every warp shadow anchored to a body in the circle. For a heartbeat, the Oathbroken saw themselves not as they were, but as something like characters scratched into a hateful book. Each was a small line of script, crossed and rewritten, hanging on the edge of erasure. Then the vision folded away. The forge pits rushed back. Rise, Malith said. Your first hunt has been named. Hololithic banners flickered into existence above the pits, icons projecting into the smog. A red-lined representation of a world filled the air, marked with cog glyphs and skulls, orbiting in a sea of hazard runes. A forge complex on the galactic rim, Malith said. Once loyal, now a furnace of Xenos. The orcs came first, drawn by the promise of loot, turning the forges into factories for their war machines. The Tyranids followed, attracted by the concentration of biomass. The two, swarms, met, and they have been killing and breeding and killing again ever since. Images shivered across the projection. Scrap gargants walked through fields of chitin and talons. Hive nodes rose like cancerous towers from the wreckage of manufactorums. In the skies, spore clouds fought with orc rocks for control of the polluted winds, ship graveyards burning as both species tore at the offal of previous battles. Billions of cultists and traitor guardsmen have already been fed into that grinder, Malith said. They have achieved little except to teach the Xenos new ways to kill. The Warmaster wishes the stalemate broken. He wishes the forge reclaimed or rendered into unusable ruin. Red icons representing the Oathbroken's patched together strike cruisers dropped into the projection, spearing toward the embattled world. Your first hunt, Malith intoned. The Xenos furnace. Rauk felt something stir in his chest at the sight. Not hope, never that. But a sense of direction, a target to push all his contempt against. Good, Vorath growled over the Vox, something worth biting. The mustering pits emptied as embarkation orders rolled through the Vox. The Oathbroken shuffled and clanked and limped toward the waiting transports, their chain bindings replaced with maglocks and hard seals. Servitors trudged alongside, hauling crates of ammunition and barrels of stolen Xenos flesh to feed the crude augmetics that some of them now required. Rauk stood at the threshold of the embarkation ramp to his assigned strike vessel, one palm resting on the scarred metal of the hull, feeling the old ship's machine spirit rumbling within. It was a ruin, cobbled together from at least 3 different classes of warship, its profile a jagged confusion of mismatched armor and gun decks. But its engines burned hot, and its lances still sparked with hunger. "Watch, Captain," Malith said as he slid past, tail coiling up the ramp. "Do you dream?" Rauk tilted his blind helm, feeling the sorcerer's warp signature brush against him like a cold, oily tide. "Not in any way that matters," he said. "Good," Malith replied. "The warp will give you enough visions without your own mind adding noise." As if in answer, the Forge World's skies screamed. Reality buckled at high altitude as the first of the Oathbroken's vessels tore free of the atmosphere, climbing on pillars of flame. The macro hulk above shuddered, opening its ragged hangar bays to belch out escort craft and demonic escorts. The wider armada wheeled, turning its weapons toward a distant swathe of stars where the Imperium still held too much ground. In the command sanctum of his vessel, Malith Zar stood before the viewing blister as the demon Forge World shrank behind them. Warp runes traced luminous paths across the glass. He reached out with his mind, fingers of thought extending into the immaterium, testing the currents ahead. He saw the Xenos furnace. He saw a world that was no longer truly a world, but a layered hive of metal and meat. He heard orc engines laughing, a noise like rolling thunder and breaking bone. He felt the hive mind's cold, uncaring hunger scraping against the surface of his own mind, trying to measure him for inclusion in its perfect, devouring pattern. And beneath it all, he heard screaming, not from any specific throat, not from any one species, just the accumulated echo of billions of deaths, layered atop one another until the warp around that world seethed like a pot about to boil over. The vision stabbed into him with enough force to stagger his physical body. He clutched his staff, helm pressing against the glass, teeth bared under the mask. Behind him, the strike cruiser's warp engines reached critical chant. Gellerfields flared, flickering silver against the deep black. The ship shuddered. "First hunt," Malith whispered. The stars stretched, bled, and were gone, replaced by the roiling madness of the Immaterium as the Oathbroken plunged into it, carried toward a furnace fueled by screaming flesh. The Xenos furnace hung before them as a wound in the void. Rauk Sable felt it before the Auspex data resolved. The augmetic thorns buried in his skull translated the silent roars of tortured gravity and burning reactors into a pressure at the back of his ruined eyes. The strike cruiser's bridge around him was a hollow in the dark, filled with murmuring serfs and the crackle of ancient cogitators. He stood at the viewing blister, helm lenses still black, armored hands resting on the rail. "Translate complete," murmured some mortal officer behind him. "We are in high orbit. Emperor, forgive us." The machine spirit of the blister shuddered as it unshuttered. The void beyond bloomed into his perception. Debris filled the near space around the world. It was not the clean ring of a defeated fleet. It was a choking, drifting graveyard. Shattered starships tumbled in slow procession, their broken hulls webbed with glistening cords of tyrannid biomass. Hive growths the size of small cities clung to cruiser prows, thick with chitin towers and spore sacs, slowly devouring metal and flesh alike. Orc rocks and kill cruisers slammed and scraped against these growths, claws and grapnels tearing out slabs of organic matter that they fed into roaring furnaces in their bellies. Here and there, void hulks drifted, ancient and nameless, dragged into the feeding frenzy by cruel chance. Tyrannid tendrils had burrowed through their decks, sprouting forests of bone and tooth from their weapon mounts. Orc boarding torpedoes were still lodged in their flanks like rusted arrows embedded in old scars. Macro cannon shells flashed in the dark. Lance beams speared out in random arcs as orcs fired at anything that moved, and some things that did not. Tyrannid living torpedoes writhed through the wreck clouds, leaving brief trails of luminescent spores before punching into metal to disgorge fanged horrors into already broken compartments. Millions had died here before the Oathbroken arrived. Hundreds of millions. Entire battle fleets had been fed into this ring, all ground down to tumbling scrap and drifting bone. The Vox picked up nothing but screams and static, old distress calls replaying on endless loop, overlain by the mad laughter of orc war bosses and the inhuman shrieks of synapse beasts exerting their control. Rauk drank it in like stale air. Orbit is contested, a serf reported, trying to keep his voice level. Heavy orc presence, Tyrannid void forms throughout, no intact friendly assets in theatre. No friendly assets, Rauk repeated softly, only unfinished killing. Behind him, Malith Zar stood at a secondary console, one gauntleted hand resting on the rune-inscribed glass, the other curled around his staff. His lower body coiled and uncoiled in restless loops, cables and demon, flesh rasping over the deck. Witchlight pulsed behind his helm. "They do not even know we are here yet," the sorcerer said. "Both swarms are blind with hunger. It is almost peaceful." Vorath Chiron laughed from where he leaned against a support pillar, his chain arms hanging loose. "Then we should wake them," he said. "I did not come to watch Xenos fornicate with wreckage." Rauk ignored him and turned his head slightly, feeling the bridge's array of data feeds align with his attention. "Status of the drop batteries," he voxed to the ship's magos. "Loaded," came the reply, voice a buzz of static and binharic. "Pods armed. Targeting solutions unreliable. Atmospheric conditions hostile. Impact survival probability diminished." "Good," Rauk said. "Open launch doors." Warning klaxons howled through the cruiser's arteries. In the hangar decks deep below, immense petals of armored plating split open, exposing banks of drop pods to the starlight and the distant, polluted glow of the world below. The Xenos furnace was a forge world once, its surface a sprawl of manufacturum continents and hive cities, belching industry into a slate-grey sky. Now those continents were scabbed over with alien growth. Orc scrap hives rose where once orderly factories had stood, their towers a riot of welded plates and cannon barrels. Between them, Tyrannid creepers had overrun transit lines and hab blocks, turning streets into pulsing rivers of meat. Storm clouds boiled above this patchwork hellscape, thick with spore dust and toxic fumes. Lightning arced between the highest Gargant towers and the tallest Tyrannid spires, each strike sending showers of incandescent scrap and chitin tumbling down. Rauk saw none of it with eyes, but the augur returns painted a picture in his head all the same. "The longer we wait, the more of them there are," he said. "We are not here to observe. We are here to break their pattern." He opened the Vox to the oath broken, his voice carried into 1,000 damaged helms. "Pods to launch stations," he ordered. "Full assault configuration. We drop through the worst of it. We land where it hurts." The Oathbroken moved through the cruiser's corridors in a clanking, shuffling tide. Their armor, still soot-marked from the Demon Forge's brandings, groaned as they forced their broken bodies into the cramped confines of drop harnesses. Chains clicked into locking rings. Restraints folded over limbs that were not always there, servo arms adjusting to hold pistons, claws, chain housings. In one pod, Vorath stood at the center, braced in his cradle by thick clamps around his waist and spine. His chain arms were locked at his sides, teeth stilled. The much-abused cogitator that governed the pod's descent whined a litany of protest as it interfaced with his armor's signal. He answered with a growl. Remember, Malith's voice hissed over the internal vox, weaving into every personal channel. You cannot outnumber the enemy. You cannot even hope to match them. Your purpose is to strike where their flesh and metal knot together, where their patterns intersect. There, a single worthy blow is worth more than all the laser guns in this sector. A single worthy blow, Vorath muttered, so long as there are many of them. In the launch bays, warning runes cycled from black to sickly green. Drop pattern set, intoned the Magos. Impact zones designated. Emperor's corpse not acknowledged. Launch, Rauk said. The world became fire and screaming metal. Drop pods hurled outward on pillars of plasma and vented fury. They sliced through the flickering shield envelope, punching into the debris ring. For a few heartbeats, they flew through fields of tumbling wreckage and drifting corpses, the impact of small debris clanging against their hulls like hail. Then they hit the meat storm. Tyrannid spores closed around them. In drifting clouds, bulbous sacs fat with corrosive mist and parasitic worms. Some burst against the pod's armored shells, smearing them in acid that hissed and ran in smoking rivulets. Others clung, their tendrils probing for weaknesses. Orc flak cannons latched onto the descent vectors with crude enthusiasm. Great shells screamed upward, bursting into clouds of jagged metal that ripped through clusters of spores, shredding them into bloody vapor. A pod to Rauk's left took a direct hit. One moment its transponder chimed in the data streams, broadcasting squad vitals, eagerness and hate. The next, there was a flare of white and red, a brief spike of shocked pain, and then a gap where once there had been life. The pod became a blossom of torn metal and vaporized ceramite, its occupants smeared across the upper atmosphere as a burning, brief aurora. Two more vanished into the maw of a particularly dense spore bank. Their signals scrambled and then smothered as biomass wrapped around them in choking embraces. Pods lost, someone reported. It did not matter who. Adjust nothing, Rock replied. We knew the cost. His own pod bucked as a near miss rocked it. Restraints creaked. The deck under his boots vibrated, the distant thump of flak impacts translating into dull notes through the metal. Drops of molten exterior plating dribbled down the viewing slit like black rain. Atmospheric entry hit a heartbeat later. The pod shuddered as its outer skin turned red, then white. The world became raw and pressure. Gravity tied itself in knots around Rauk's stomach, trying to drag his organs up through his throat. If he had still possessed eyes, tears would have boiled there. Then the turbulence evened. The pod's retros howled. Impact runes flashed. Brace! Vorath barked to his own squad, laughter bubbling under the word. We are coming! The drop pods were screaming meteors as they lanced through the cloud cover. To those on the ground, they would have been streaks of fire against the constant poisonous smoke, each trailing wake a promise of new violence. The surface war had already been raging for long enough that time had begun to lose meaning for its participants. Vast continents of biomatter pulsed and shifted, where the tyrannid infestation had sunk its feeder tendrils into the planetary crust. Flesh fields rippled under the winds, studded with chitin towers that spat spore mines into the sky. Rivers ran not with water, but with nutrient sludge, thick and clotted with the remains of what had been eaten and digested. Against this seethed the orc scrap hives. They strode across the corrupted Manufactorum plains on articulated legs lashed together from train carriages and titan limbs. Gargants, crude and monstrous, lumbered through seas of smaller orc war machines, their hulls festooned with gun mounts and banners of flayed skin. Their bellies housed foundries and breeding vats, fires burning behind teeth, like the furnace doors of industrial gods. Where the tides met, the world broke. Tyrannid biotitans, masses of bone and sinew big enough to blot out the horizon, crashed into gargants with enough force to send shockwaves through the ground for kilometers around. Claws scythed through metal. Power claws seized chitinous limbs and ripped them free. Smaller organisms swarmed underfoot, a living carpet of snapping jaws and stamping boots. The air was thick with flying beasts and roaring aircraft. Orc fighter bombers, their fuselages stitched together from armor plates and half-remembered blueprints, dived in erratic arcs, firing wildly into flocks of shrieking tyrannid harpies. Spore mines detonated against their wings, tearing them apart in mid-air and sending them pinwheeling into the ground. On the ground, rivers of gaunts and Gretchen flowed around the feet of their larger kin, colliding in shrieking, chattering masses. Knobs and warrior beasts bellowed commands or psychic impulses, driving the smaller creatures into ever more suicidal charges. The numbers were beyond counting. Hundreds of billions of organisms had been born to die here, and more were growing in hidden nodules with every passing moment. Into that storm fell the Oath Broken. Rauk's pod hit with the impact of a dropped thunderbolt. The shock ran through his bones and armor, a single total body blow. The flower petal doors blew outward on detonating bolts, shredding a knot of nearby gaunts into ragged pieces. Dust and flesh fragments gusted inward, carried on gusts of scorched air. Rauk stepped out into the killing field. They had come down in the midst of a shifting border zone between orc scrap trenches and a freshly extruded tyrannid rampart. A crude barricade of wrecked tanks and stacked corpses marked the orc side. A wall of thorned chitin and pulsing biosacks marked the tyrannid edge. The space between was a no-man's land where neither side held comfortable dominance, churned into a slurry of mud, blood, and spent shells. Bolter fire stitched the air from the orc lines, shells whining past in ragged arcs. Gaunts poured from their hive wall, scything talons raised, chittering. The air stank of propellant and acid. The Oath Broken did not hesitate. Voreth's pod struck a little further along the line, carving its own crater into the gore-soaked soil. Its doors blew off so hard that one flattened a charging orc boy into a smear. Voreth lunged out in the next instant, chain arms roaring into life with a feral howl of spinning teeth. He hit the nearest knot of gaunts like a thrown saw. Limbless torso or not, he moved with horrifying speed. Chain housings screamed as they bit into flesh, carving through chitin plates and skulls alike. Gaunts came apart in clouds of spattering ichor, pieces of them flung into the air to rain down on friend and foe alike. Vorath bellowed wordless exultation, his helm slick with alien blood, his teeth bared in a rictus grin. "Come on then," he roared into the Vox, voice barely audible over the grind of his weapons. "Come on!" Rauk took in the tactical picture through the chaos. Orcs on one side, Tyrannids on the other, both already turning their attention toward the new arrivals. His squads were fanning out from their pods in practiced patterns, moving with a cohesion that mocked their shattered bodies. "Use them," he ordered. "All of them. The aliens are walls before the real targets." He stepped forward, armor groaning, and angled his path to intersect the densest flow of gaunts. Bolter in one hand, a hooked combat blade in the other, he advanced without hurry. Gaunts leaped at him, claws extended, shrieking. He fired short, controlled bursts into their faces, exploding skulls into sprays of bone. When they got too close, he swung his blade in brutal arcs, hacking limbs and heads. Dead Xenos piled around his boots, their carcasses forming a barrier that slowed the advance of those behind them. On his flanks, Red Iron squads set their heavy weapons on the shoulders of howling orcs, using the larger greenskins as literal shields. Crude, heavy bolters, bolted straight into their bionic armatures, thundered, tearing through waves of gaunts with indiscriminate ferocity. When the makeshift shields collapsed under enemy claws or friendly fire, the Iron warriors simply kicked them aside and found more. Gilded ruin warriors slipped between hulks and shell craters with unnatural grace, their masks gleaming wetly in the haze. They moved into the densest pockets of fighting, pistols and blades flickering. Orc knobs found themselves suddenly missing eyes, throats opened with precise cuts. Gaunts stumbled as tendons were severed, falling to be trampled under their own kind. Night's Wound cloaked themselves in smoke and shadow. their vox projectors broadcasting eerie, ululating wails that made even the fearless tyrannid beasts falter for a heartbeat. They left fear where fear should not exist, twisting the instincts of predators, making them hesitate when they should charge, making them turn on one another in confusion. Overhead, Malith Zar stood on the lip of a crater, staff planted in the churned earth, armor splattered with alien gore. His mind reached out across the battlefield, fingers of thought probing the psychic static. The hive mind pressed against him like a vast, cold ocean, impersonal and crushing. Orc psychic emissions clawed at the edges, raucous and hot, a cacophony of belief and stupidity. He carved himself a space in that miasma the only way he knew how, with violence. He seized a knot of gaunts in the warp, not their bodies, but the tiny sparks of instinct that flickered within them and compressed them into a ball. Their skulls popped like overripe fruit, bodies collapsing mid-stride as invisible pressure crushed their brains. He did the same to a clutch of storm boys mid-jump, their heads detonating inside their helmets, sending headless corpses spiraling into the dirt. The sudden absence left a clear lane, a trench of fresh corpses cut through the writhing mass. "Space!" he hissed into the Vox. "Now!" Vorath barreled into that corridor without needing to be told twice, chain blades chewing through the dying and the still living alike, carving a path toward the thicker hive structures beyond. Red iron poured sustained fire down it, turning stragglers into shredded meat. Rauk redirected other squads to widen it, stepping on whatever got in the way. This was how the Oath Broken worked. The Deathwatch, in their loyalty, would have descended from low orbit in carefully plotted insertions. They would have chosen landing zones beyond the worst of the fighting, reconnoitered, struck from angles of maximum efficiency. Each kill team would have moved like a scalpel, cutting at specific Xenos nodes, retrieving trophies, leaving warnings. The Oathbroken were not scalpels, they were shrapnel, packed into the same ordnance as their enemies. They fell directly into the throat of the war and forced their way through by being too stubborn and too vicious to die quickly. They did not care which alien breed absorbed most of their fire. They did not care how many human collaborators died under their boots. Their role was to punch a wound into the chaos and keep gouging until the galaxy bled. "Objective," Rauk voxed as they pushed deeper through the mangled no-man's land. "Repeat the tasking." Malith sent the data across the net, more image than word. A growth ahead, deeper in the Tyrannid territory, where the infestation had overrun an orc scrap hive, but not yet fully digested it. There, the Tyrannid flesh and orc metal had become so entwined that the hive mind had decided to experiment. Something new was growing, a cyst shrine where evolving bioforms used orc engine caskets as gestation chambers. "Brood shrine," Rauk said aloud. "A fusion that neither side truly intended. If it lives, it spreads. The War Master wishes it dead before it becomes something that even he cannot reliably direct against his enemies." He did not bother relaying the part about what would happen to them if they failed. They all knew. The path became more treacherous as they advanced. Tyrannid growth thickened underfoot, turning the ground into a slick, yielding surface that squelched unpleasantly with every step. Orc scrap layers jutted from it at odd angles, half-digested armor plates protruding from fleshy mounds, like the bones of some gigantic corpse. They began to see the experiments. The first hybrid monstrosity came stamping out of a side corridor, with a bellow that was half engine roar, half psychic shriek. It had the rough frame of a deaf dread, an orc walker bristling with claws and saws, but its armor plates were no longer entirely metal. Chitin ridges had sprouted along its limbs. Its power plant bulged and shifted as if something inside it was breathing. Where the pilot's canopy should have been, a cluster of Tyrannid eyes blinked wetly beneath a mesh of cables. A drooling maw yawned open where there should have been an exhaust, lined with teeth better suited to a warrior beast than an engine. It charged, saw arms spinning, jaws snapping. Red iron answered with a barrage of heavy stub fire, rounds sparking off its uneven carapace. Vorath hurled himself at one leg, chain arm shrieking as it bit into the joint. Sparks and ichor sprayed. The hybrid lurched, one limb buckling, and crashed to its side, flailing. Gilded Ruin stepped in close, pistols barking precise shots into the eye cluster, each impact punching through the soft tissue and the bone beneath. The monstrous machine spasmed, limbs threshing, then went still, fluids leaking into the turf. "Interesting," Malith murmured, watching from a distance. "The hive mind is playing with orc concepts of war machines. If it learns to breed these in number, even the War Master's fleets will find themselves occupied." "Then we break its toys," Vorath spat, ripping his chain blades free. They pressed on, encountering more such abominations. Walkers whose cockpits were swollen sacks filled with fluid and twitching limbs. Gun platforms whose barrels had become the spines of venom cannon organisms, firing gouts of corrosive bile instead of solid shells. Squiggoth corpses animated from within by burrowing warriors, their hides writhing as internal claws fought for purchase. The Oathbroken tested weapons on them with brutal pragmatism. Some responded better to melter blasts, others to concentrated autocannon fire. Once it was clear how to kill them efficiently, those methods were applied without mercy. Occasionally, if a creature fell but still twitched, a warrior would cut away a limb or an armor plate to bolt onto his own rig, wasting nothing. Gilded Ruin took pleasure in their work. One masked marine carved looping sigils into the armor, of a writhing hybrid, slicing through the upper layers of flesh just deeply enough to make it scream, but not enough to sever arteries. He watched, head tilted, as the creature thrashed and bellowed, timing how long it took to finally bleed out, despite its unnatural vigor. Night's Wound collected fragments of alien skull and chitin, mounting them on poles of scrap metal that they planted at junctions and tunnel mouths. They arranged corpses in grotesque tableau, orc and tyrannid bodies intertwined in parodies of alliance or devouring. Some they hung by their own intestines from rafters of rusted iron, bodies spinning slowly. They were not sure if the hive mind knew fear or if orcs could read such messages. It did not matter. The totems pleased them, and they pleased the ghosts in their heads. At last, the brood shrine loomed. It rose from the corrupted manufacturum plane like a tumor grown in defiance of geometry. The base was an old orc scrap fortress, its walls of welded tank, hulls and broken titan limbs half subsumed by tyrannid flesh. Towers of bone had grown through its battlements, curving and twisting into the sky, linked by webs of sinew that pulsed with a slow heartbeat. Bioluminescent cysts glowed along those webs, casting a sickly light over the killing grounds around the structure. From cracks in the lower walls, a constant stream of smaller creatures poured forth. Gaunts and Gretchen, hybrid things with mismatched limbs and extra jaws, all surged into the ongoing battle that raged in concentric rings around the shrine, as orcs and tyrannids fought for proximity to this font of new horror. "Red iron," Rauk voxed. "We need a breach." The siege cohort advanced with relish, heavy weapons slamming out disciplined volleys. They targeted structural weak points where metal met bone, where orc welds had been disrupted by tyrannid growths. Melter beams bored through towers of fused armor. Autocannon shells chewed away support limbs. Slowly, under that storm, a section of the hybrid wall sagged and cracked. Vorath was the first through when it collapsed. He plunged into the breach waist deep in algae-colored ichor, chain arms flaying aside the half-formed organisms that slithered in the gap. Inside, the air was thick and wet, tasting of rust and old blood. The floor sloped downward into a vast chamber where the orc fortress's internal machinery had been hollowed out and repurposed. The hive heart beat here. Huge reactors of orc design, their casings painted in crude glyphs and the usual daubed slogans, were cracked open like eggs. From them, tyrannid tendrils had emerged, wrapping around energy cores and fuel lines, siphoning that power into great vats of fermenting biomass that glowed with inner fire. Within those vats, shapes moved, silhouettes too complex and shifting to name. Shoots ran from the vats into spawning pits below, dropping still dripping organisms into amniotic pools where they twitched and grew, swollen, with potential. Metal arms of obvious orc design had been reshaped to cradle those pools, feeding them fresh nutrient gruel and scrap metal as if nurturing mech creations. The hive mind was making new soldiers from orc ideas of engines. "Enough," Malith hissed, stepping into the chamber. Warp fire crackled around his staff, reacting with the pulsing energies in the air. He looked to the generators, felt the crude orc reactor spirits still snarling within, angry at their confinement. He touched the Tyrannid feeder strands, felt the cold, alien will that had bent those spirits, but not entirely broken them. "We will give them all what they want," he said. He strode to the nearest power core, staff held out. Red Iron secured perimeters, firing into the spawning pits whenever something large moved too quickly. Vorath and his cohort cut down any creature that tried to climb from the vats. "Gilded ruin," Rauk ordered. "Plant charges where the agency is used to. Knights, wound, prepare to clear us a path out should any of us live through this." As they worked, Malith began his rite. He whispered to the trapped orc machine spirits, feeding their rage, promising them an explosion worthy of the loudest war. They answered with flickers of agreement. Their simple minds easily turned towards self-annihilation if it meant the promise of impact and noise. He laced that waking fury with warp fire, threading it through the Tyrannid feeder strands. For a moment, the hive mind recoiled, sensing something it could not fully digest. Then it surged back, trying to clamp down, to stop this anomaly. He was faster. He pressed his staff tip against the reactor's exposed heart and pushed. Power roared up through him, a torrent of stolen energy laced with alien will and orc stubbornness. It would have turned a mortal psyker to dust in a heartbeat. Malith gritted his teeth and made his soul into a conduit, forcing the blaze along paths of his choosing. The energy leapt from core to core, a daisy chain of sudden ignition. Vats boiled, spawning pits frothed, biomatter ignited from within, cooking the half-born alive. Their screams merged into a single rising note of agony. "Out," Rauk commanded. The Oathbroken turned and ran. They pounded back along the tunnels they had carved, boots pounding on metal and flesh. Behind them, the brood shrine howled. The glow inside it brightened from sickly red to a dangerous white, edges of the structure starting to melt and slump. Outside, on the killing fields, orcs and Tyrannids paused mid-slaughter, instincts warning them of coming catastrophe. Some tried to flee. Others roared defiance and charged toward the shining structure, hoping to claim its heart or simply die in the closest thing to glory their brains could manage. The brood shrine went critical. For a moment, it was a sun. Light seared across the battlefield, bleaching colors to ghosts. The initial blast obliterated everything within. Sight of the fortress, vaporizing creatures of flesh and metal alike, turning them to expanding clouds of gas and ash. Shockwaves ripped outward, tearing up great swathes of the corrupted manufacturing plain, hurling tanks, gargants, and bio-titans alike from their feet. Further out, the wave hit with enough force to crush lungs and burst eardrums. Structures collapsed, chitin cracked, armor buckled. Whole swarms vanished in an instant, untold billions of organisms reduced to unrecognizable slurry. In orbit, the ring of debris shuddered as the planet's atmosphere belched fire. Auspex, already struggling under the chaos, flared with false readings and interference. Within that storm, scattered across craters and trenches and broken growths, lay the Oathbroken. Some did not rise. Armor lay cracked open, contents boiled. Others dragged themselves upright through the settling dust and fragments, battered but intact enough to kill again. Rauk stood slowly, servos whining, the blast, having thrown him into a pile of dead gaunts and orc limbs. His armor's damage runes flared amber and red, complaining of structural strain, breached seals, the usual. "Report!" he voxed, voice rough. One by one, Cohort leaders answered. Red iron, depleted but functional. Gilded ruin, their masks scorched but intact. Knight's Wound laughing thinly over channels filled with the crackle of static. Malith's voice came last, thin but still edged with that dry amusement. Brood Shrine destroyed, the sorcerer said. The experiment is ended. The hive mind will need time to decide whether it was worth trying again. Good, Rauk said. Rally on the beacon. Salvage what you can from the dead. Then we leave this pit to its pointless war. They withdrew under cover of the chaos they had unleashed, slipping back toward their extraction coordinates, while orcs and tyranids reeled from the loss of the shrine. For once, neither side had attention to spare for a few 100 broken warriors. Later, aboard their rusted strike cruiser, they gathered in the muster bay, armor still spattered with Xeno's residue that no amount of solvent seemed able to entirely remove. Servitors moved among them, prying bent plates back into something like alignment, replacing shattered lenses, injecting combat stims to replace some of the blood they had left behind. Rauk stood apart, helm raised, listening to the steady tick of cooling metal. He expected a summons, a vox from some Black Legion lord, a word from the War Master's representative, even a curt acknowledgement of task completion. Something. Instead, only the cold voice of the ship's magos came over the internal network. Transmission received from Fleet Command, it droned. Data packet attached. Designation, Second Hunt. New target coordinates uploaded to your helm, Black Watch Captain. No praise, no comment. The first hunt, with all its cost, with the obliteration of a nascent horror that might have reshaped entire campaigns, was dismissed with a mere change of orders. Rauk felt the hatred rise, not hot, not like the berserker's rage that had claimed Vorath long ago, but slow and deep, a grinding resentment like tectonic plates shifting. It did not burn for the Xenos. They were doing only what they were made to do, stupid and perfect in their murderous simplicity. His venom was saved for those who had still intact limbs, pristine warplate, and the luxury of thinking of warriors like him as pieces on a board. He bowed his head for a moment, as if in prayer. Then he reached up, locked his helm back into place, and opened the new data in his mind. First hunt is done, he voxed to his cohorts. Second begins. There is always another war. Across the bay, broken giants straightened, weapons clanking. No one cheered, no one needed to. Their oaths held them in place, and hatred drove them forward. Baptized in alien blood, the oath-broken were ready to fall again. The second hunt smelled of familiar sin. Rauk Sable stood alone in the Strategium Sanctum, helm tucked under one arm. The blank ruin of his eyes turned toward the hololithic altar. The chamber hummed with the quiet fury of an old ship forced once more to war. Cables hung from the ceiling like iron vines. Servo skulls drifted in slow circles. Vox relays chattering soft Binharic litanies. On the altar, a world spun. Shrine world, Halix Secundus. Once it had been a jewel on the pilgrimage routes, a planet whose continents were carved into reliquary complexes and basilicas, whose oceans were choked with prayer fleets. Billions had come there to bleed their feet on sacred stones, to die in the shadow of towering cathedra and mausolea. Now, its iconography burned. The hololith showed cathedral spires wreathed in black fire, reliquary vaults cracked open to the air, processional avenues repurposed into parade grounds for heretic regiments. In the higher reaches of the atmosphere, fortress stations and orbital shrines flickered with gunfire as captured macro cannons spat at the black-hulled ships that circled beyond. Data runes scrolled in the corners of Rauk's perception. Identity tags, intercepted vox chatter, Auspex traces of warp sorcery. The cabal of the burning brand, a splinter from the Black Legion, once sworn to Abaddon's banner like any other. They had broken from the crusade when the fighting grew too hard and too thankless, when promised conquest seemed slow to materialize. They had turned their ships toward Halix Secundus, seized it in the name of the War Master, and then quietly begun to carve his sigils from their hulls. They had pretended they could hide in the shadow of the Corpse King's old shrines, the better to rule their stolen world. Chaos, in its way, was generous. It rewarded success with power beyond mortal imagining. It gave demon blades and living armor, worlds to rule and souls to torment. But the same forces that swelled a champion's strength also magnified every failure. When a warlord faltered, when a legionary fled, they did not simply die. They were marked. They were broken. Sometimes they were cast out to scrabble for scraps. Sometimes they were repurposed into tools designed to show others what happened to those who thought they could cheat their oaths. The Oathbroken existed to make such points bloody. Abaddon could have sent a grand company of his chosen to crush the Cabal. He could have dispatched a single trusted lord with orders and a fleet. Instead, he sent the maimed and the shamed, the crippled executioners, whose very presence on a battlefield screamed a warning louder than any Vox broadcast. Fail the War Master, and he does not forget you. He does not forgive you. He does not even bother to kill you cleanly. He finds a use for your ruin. Rauk slid his helm back into place, mag seals clamping shut around the scarred sockets of his neck. The world brightened in his inner vision as the helm's systems meshed with his implants, layering tactical feeds over the hololithic image. Malith Zar's presence coiled at the edge of his mind, a cold serpent of warp attention. "You remember Halix?" the sorcerer said softly from the doorway. "I do," Rauk replied. He did not turn. "I lost the Prime World. The War Master's banner burned in its ash because our extraction failed." "You retreated," Malith said, "to fight another day." The War Master did not see the nuance. He saw only that he could no longer stand upon that soil and point at his flag. Rauk's hands tightened on the rail. "Now I am sent back," he said. "Not to reclaim what was lost, but to erase those who thought they could steal even a fraction of his anger." "Think of it as symmetry," Malith murmured. "You fell there once. You will rise there now, over the bodies of those more arrogant than you." Rauk turned at last, blind helm facing the sorcerer. "There is nothing to rise to," he said. "Only another hole to fall into." Malith's laughter was a dry rasp. "Then fall hard," he said, "so that those watching from above feel the impact." The Oathbroken fell toward Halix Secundus in fires of entry. The rusted strike cruisers descended to low orbit, their hulls shuddering as flak shells and macro fire reached for them. The Cabal had turned the planet's defense grid to their own use, and they were not shy about firing those weapons at the black hulls of their former brothers. Rauk's vessel shrugged off glancing blows and shed debris like flakes of rust. Its launch bays opened like old wounds, vomiting drop craft and assault barges into the storm. The Oathbroken rode them down. Vorath stood in the prow of one assault barge, maglocks holding his lower torso to the deck, chain arms resting on its rim. Outside the viewing slit, the sky was a roiling cataract of smoke and fire. Church spires jutted from it, like broken ribs, some still bearing the corpse god's symbol, others mutilated into 8-pointed parodies. The barge's armor rang as small caliber rounds spattered against it, the Cabal's ground defenses doing their best to harry the descent. "Smells like old faith burning," Vorath said, voice crackling over the local vox. "I prefer the reek of fresh blood." "You can have both," a red iron warrior replied, checking the feed on his heavy bolter. "Be patient." The barge slammed into an open plaza before a vast basilica, retro thrusters gouging long scars in the marble. Its ramp crashed down. The Oathbroken poured out. Halix Secundus's shrine districts had once been administrative hubs for pilgrim traffic, comfortable realms of priests and governors surrounded by seas of devout wretches. Now, the plaza was a parade ground for heretic regiments. Corrupted planetary defense troops in scorched uniforms and half-torn devotional robes turned as the barge came. Down, laser guns snapping to shoulders, mouths already forming blessings to gods that were listening now. Behind them, waves of cultists surged, carrying banners that bore the Cabal's symbol, a stylized brand wreathed in black flame. Their eyes were bright with fanaticism. Their throats were hoarse from screaming litanies to lords who were too busy to care. The Oathbroken did not slow. Rauk led from the front, limping as always, his scrap-patched armor fresh, scored with the sigil burned into his chest by the Dark Apostle. Bolterfire walked ahead of him in short, precise bursts. Every shot found a chest, a skull, a throat. Cultists fell. Defense troopers jerked and slammed against the stone. Gouts of blood sprayed across the cracked marble, darkening the engraved names of countless long-dead martyrs. Red Iron spread out on his flanks, heavy weapons coughing in deep, repeated barks. Their target selection was crude but effective. They chewed apart ranks, not individuals, turning close-packed formations into heaps of shredded meat. Gilded ruin flowed around them, pistols spitting, blades whispering in tight arcs. They cut down officers first, men who thought themselves commanders simply because they had inherited rank markings with their uniforms. Knight's wound vanished in a flicker into the smoke, their vox projectors already spooling up. A moment later, the plaza filled with a new sound, a keening note that rose beneath the crack of gunfire. It was not language. It was an old, honed weapon of terror, a chorus of screams tuned to trigger prey instincts in anything with a spine. The mortal cultists broke first, dropping weapons, clutching at heads, backing away from the black-clad giants, even as their masters shouted at them to stand. The Oathbroken did not call to them, did not offer them mercy in exchange for betrayal. They were not here to recruit. They walked through the collapsing lines like threshers. Rauk stepped onto the chest of a fallen preacher, crushing ribs. The man's eyes bulged behind cracked augmetic lenses. His vox grill spat static prayers to a dozen names of the same god. "You could have served us," the preacher coughed. "We would have given you relics, power. We worshipped you." "We are not here to be worshipped," Rauk said, and put a bolt through his skull. They pushed on, ignoring surrendering hands and begging voices. They had been ordered to make an example, and examples were not made with clemency. Behind them, Malith Zar watched from the basilica steps, tail coiled, staff resting in one hand. The plaza glowed in his warp sight as a growing stain of death, fresh souls tearing free from ruined bodies in a constant stream. He did not bother to harvest them. They were too thin, too full of second-hand faith. "Burn them," he voxed, tone lazy. "All of them, structures included." Rauk did not need to ask which structures. The Cabal had turned entire hive spires into reliquary, towers, filling their upper vaults with stolen relics and the lower levels with zealots eager to bleed for their new lords. Such vertical charnel houses could have been converted into useful bastions for the Black Legion if taken intact. Abaddon had been clear in his ordering voice. He wanted no such salvage. He wanted a message. Orbital fire fell an hour later. As the Oathbroken advanced through the shrine districts, marking pockets of resistance and rooting out nodes of the Cabal's presence, their strike cruisers and attendant gunships adjusted orbital vectors. Lance beams speared down from the void, stabbing into the bases of the hive spires that had been most thoroughly corrupted. Volcano cannon, repurposed from seized defense platforms, roared, their beams boring through kilometer-thick strata of habitation, sanctuary, and ossuary. Whole spires fell like murdered giants. Billions died in those collapses, their bodies crushed under cascading towers and imploding vaults. The screams of their passing were recorded, amplified, and broadcast on every open Vox channel. Servitors in the ships above rerouted those frequencies, sending them out on tight beam transmissions toward listening posts known to belong to other Black Legion warbands. "Hear this," the message said without words. "See what happens to those who think a world can be theirs without the War Master's leave." In the ruins of one toppled hive, Vorath Chiron counted his kills in humming snarls. He led Red Iron through what remained of the Cabal's inner defense cadres, Terminator-armored elites who had once marched as honored warriors beneath Abaddon's banner. Their warplate was pristine, or had been before Red Iron's guns began chewing it apart. Lapis inlays gleamed in their trim, demon-etched sigils pulsing faintly with favor. Vorath hated them on sight. They represented everything he had been denied, everything the gods had taken away when they turned their attention to fresher. Toys, full limbs, responsive armor, demon blades that whispered sweetly, rather than sleeping sullen in their scabbards. When he fell upon them, it was with a personal joy that came very close to love. The corridor they held was a sanctified passage between relic vaults, or had been. Now it was a throat of stone and ceramite, its frescoes defaced with burning brands. The Cabal Terminators had turned it into a killing ground, firing their combi bolters in disciplined volleys, Reaper autocannons scything down any who dared step into the open. Red Iron did not stop. They went to ground behind fallen statues and shattered alcoves, then pushed forward by inches, laying down their own suppressive fire. Broken heavy bolters mounted on their bionic arms roared back, shells punching dents in Terminator pauldrons, sparking off their fields. Vorath did not bother with cover at all. He charged. Bolter shells slammed into his chest, his shoulders, his helm. Some punched through, gouging, furrows in his flesh and armor. Others detonated on impact, throwing him sideways, sending fragments of ceramite spinning. He roared through the impacts, chain arms whining, and threw himself at the nearest Terminator like a human-shaped storm. His chain blades tore into the champion's chestplate, teeth screeching against ancient ceramite. Sparks blasted out in showers. The Terminator swung a power axe in return, the weapon's head leaving bright lines in the air. It connected with Vorath's helm, smashing the left side flat and sending vision runes spinning. Vorath bit him. His teeth sank into the Terminator's exposed throat, where armor joints met and were not perfectly sealed. He tore and wrenched. Blood gushed into his mouth, hot and thick, spilling down over his chin. The Terminator staggered, axe flailing, then dropped as Vorath's chain blades finally worried through plate and bone enough to reach meat. Red Iron followed his example with less savagery but equal determination. They advanced over the bodies they made, firing even at point blank, turning once proud suits of Terminator armor into bent, leaking shells. The corridor became a choke point, clogged with wreckage, ceramite, bone, and altar stone, all ground together under their boots. By the time they reached the far end, they were walking ankle-deep in gore. Spent casings crunched underfoot like dry leaves. The air was thick with cordite fumes and the sweet rot of opened bodies. "Count?" Vorath asked, breath rasping. "High," a Red Iron gunner said with grim satisfaction. "Enough to matter, not enough to make anyone thank us." Vorath laughed. "Then we must kill more," he said. Elsewhere in the shrine complex, Malith Zar wove a different kind of destruction. He had gathered a group of captured Cabal Marines in the vestry of a once sacred basilica, their arms clamped to the floor by mag shackles, their helm seals forced open. They glared up at him with eyes still, bright with borrowed favor. Their souls burned hotter in his sight than those of common traitors, their past victories having drawn real attention from the warp. He decided to give them a lesson. "You ran," he told them conversationally, his staff resting lightly against his shoulder. "Not from this battle, from another, a system, a campaign. You saw the odds shift against you, and rather than bleed as ordered, you chose to turn your backs on the banner that had given you so much." One snarled, showing teeth with filed edges. "We chose to live," he spat. "The War Master fed us into impossible wars and called it honor. We chose our own fate." "No," Malith said softly. "You chose a slower death." He reached out with his mind and sank invisible talons into the echoes of their pasts. Memories rose under his touch like bubbles from a deep trench. He found the moments he needed easily. They were bright scars in the souls before him. He took one Marine back to the point where he had first turned his ship's prow away from the rest of the Black Legion, powering down transponders, praying no one would notice. He made that moment stretch, slow, then loop. The Marine felt his hand reach for the controls over and over, each time aware of what it meant, each time unable to stop himself. Cowardice elongated, made into an unending present. Another he dragged back to a breached trench line, where mortal soldiers had begged him to hold with them. He had decided their lives were not worth his armor, had withdrawn, leaving them to be overrun. Malith locked him there, made him stand just beyond the lip of the trench, watching those faces disappear under a tide of bayonets and alien claws, again and again, unable to lift his weapon to intervene. Each of the prisoners found his own moment of failure and lived there for an eternity compressed into a heartbeat. Malith caught those loops, compressed them further, and pushed. He sent the concentrated essence of their cowardice screaming into the warp, a bundle of psychic amusement tied with a neat ribbon of spite. Demons, sensing the offering, pounced upon it, tearing at the tastes of fear, laughter echoing in places where no sane sound could exist. For all time now, Malith said to the shuddering bodies on the floor, your names will be spoken in mockery by things older and crueler than you can imagine. That is your legacy. He ended their lives with a gesture, boiling their brains in their skulls. It was almost a mercy compared to what awaited the pieces of them now drifting in the immaterium. The cabal of the burning brand did not fall all at once. They fought hard, as befit those who had once been worthy of the Black Legion. But they had grown complacent on their stolen world, too used to worship and too unused to the raw, grinding attrition of a true crusade. The oath broken gave them no ground to stand on. They cut down their champions. They burned their reliquary towers. They took their symbols and stomped them into the ash. Wherever cult regiments tried to rally, the oath broken smashed them, not stopping to gloat or to preach. They were here as hammers, not shepherds. When organized resistance finally shattered, the planetary reprisal truly began. Orbital bombardment intensified. Lance strikes walked across the surface, tracing lines through hive districts and manufacturing planes. Bombing wings of captured gunships and chaos-tainted fighter craft screamed down to unload their payloads of incendiaries and rad munitions. What had been cities of millions became plates of fused glass and blackened bone. Vox operators on the ships above opened every channel. They let the screams through. They let the crackling prayers and panicked orders and death rattles of an entire world roll out into the void. They boosted and focused those signals, sending them toward known muster points for Black Legion warbands, toward demon worlds where champions sat in their fortresses and told themselves stories about their invincibility. Listen, the screams said. This is what happens when you are forgotten, when you try to be more than the War Master has decreed you should be, when you claim what is his. On the ground, Rauk stood in the shattered nave of the planet's primary basilica and faced the Cabal's lord. The man had chosen his battlefield. Even in defeat, he had a flair for spectacle. The basilica's roof had been blasted open earlier in the campaign, its vaults exposed to a sky choked with smoke. Starlight and firelight mingled with the glare of burning votive shrines along the walls. The once pristine marble floor was cracked, its inlaid sigils scorched and smeared with blood. The Cabal's champion stood at the far end, in front of the desecrated altar. He wore armor that made mockery of Rauk's. Black and gold, yes, but without a single patch plate or exposed cabling. The lapis inlays along his trim gleamed. With inner light, every line of scripture picked out in perfect clarity. His helm was crested, a snarling demon face wrought around its grill, eyes burning with warp fire. In his fist, he held a blade that was more wound than metal, its edge a writhing line of dark light. "Rauk Sable," he called, voice booming in the ravaged chamber. "Come to abase yourself again on this world I see." Rauk limped forward, boots scraping over broken stone, stepping around the corpses of Cabal elites who had tried to hold the nave and failed. His own armor was a patchwork of scorched plates and visible repairs, the brand over his heart still throbbing with a dull, constant ache. "You ran," Rauk said. "Off the field, away from the crusade, away from the banner." The champion laughed. "I chose another theatre," he replied. "I claimed a world in the War Master's name. I made it rich. I filled it with worship. I turned its defense grid against our enemies. That was not enough for him. He wanted me on my knees, begging, so I left." Rauk tilted his head. "And you thought he would not notice," he said. "That you could hide in the shadow of these stones, that the gods would forget." "I thought he would have bigger concerns than one little world," the champion snarled. "I was wrong, so he sent you, his crippled curs." The demon blade in his hand shrieked as he raised it in challenge. Rauk drew his own weapon slowly. It was no relic, a simple chainsword, its teeth worn and re-sharpened a dozen times, its casing patched. He held his bolter in his other hand, feeling the weight. "You had your choices," he said. "Now you get mine." He fired. The Chaos Lord was no fool. His sword moved in a blur, batting aside the first volley of bolts, sending them ricocheting into shattered pillars and broken pews. He advanced as he did it, armor servos whining with power, closing the distance between them with surprisingly fast strides. Warp, light crawled around him in a corona. His favors made manifest. Rauk's shots grew less accurate as that aura warped local space, rounds veering, impact patterns shifting. He discarded the bolter and stepped in. The demon blade came down in a two-handed arc that would have cut a mortal warrior in half. Rauk met it with his chainsword, locking teeth against warp edge. The two weapons spat sparks and howled. The impact jarred him to the core, every old wound flaring. The Lord was stronger, favored, whole. He drove Rauk back, each blow ringing against his block, armor taking glancing bites that would have amputated limbs from lesser men. Rauk yielded ground grudgingly, boots slipping on slick stone, using his limp, his lowered center of gravity, to roll with the impacts rather than absorb them cleanly. "You are done, broken thing," the champion snarled, blade lashing out in a flurry. "You should have stayed a warning in some forgotten corner of the eye. Instead, you came to die in front of me." Rauk did not answer. He gritted his teeth and waited. The Lord overextended. He lunged, hoping to finish it with a thrust through Rauk's chest, demon blade twitching with eagerness. Rauk let himself fall sideways instead of trying to parry. The point of the sword carved a gouge across his breastplate, biting into the already burned brand. Pain flared like a new sun in his ribs, but he was moving, his limp turning into a roll, his free hand snapping out to grab at the Lord's sword arm. He caught the wrist, feeling the warp heat through layers of metal and flesh. He yanked, pulling the Lord off balance. His chainsword came up and around, not to parry, but to slam its buzzing teeth into the back of the champion's knee. Ceramite shrieked. The joint gave with a spray of sparks and a crunch of bone. The Cabal Lord dropped to one knee, roaring in fury. Rauk did not give him time to recover. He surged up, driving his shoulder into the Lord's chest, smashing him backward. They crashed onto the steps of the altar, armor clashing, weapons tangled. The demon blade slashed wildly, carving chunks from the sacred stone, gouging channels in the already ruined icon of the Corpse King. Rauk headbutted him. Helm smashed against helm, cracks spiderwebbed across the Lord's lenses. They broke fully on the second impact, glass shards embedding in his eyes. He screamed, temporarily blind. Rauk seized the moment. He planted one boot, that ugly, scrap-plated thing that had trudged through more graves than he could count, on the Lord's chest, and shoved, pinning him against the altar. His chainsword had jammed, teeth clogged with ceramite fragments, so he dropped it and reached for the other weapon he still had. His boot. He shifted his weight, servos whining, and brought his heel down on the Lord's helm. Once, twice. On the third impact, the crest crumpled. On the fourth, the helm itself gave way, folding inward like tin. On the fifth, there was a wet, thick sound and a spray that painted Rauk's greaves a darker shade. He kept going until there was nothing left under his boot but a pulped mixture of bone, brain, and demon metal. The blade the Lord had carried writhed once and then went still, its hungry light sputtering away. Denied its chosen wielder, it sulked, still dangerous, but without direction. Rauch stepped back, chest heaving. Pain lanced through his ribs with each breath, the wound over his brand still searing. He ignored it, stooping to pick up his chainsword again. Faithless, he said, looking down at the ruin, and now forgotten. The second hunt ended with smoke and ash. Halleck's Secundus burned. Its shrine complexes collapsed. Its defense grids fell silent as their command systems were annihilated. Those traitor regiments that had surrendered after the Cabal's fall found that there was no safety in kneeling. The Oathbroken exterminated them with the same dispassion they had, shown to howling zealots, erasing every trace of the Cabal's markings wherever they found them. When at last their strike cruisers clawed free of the planet's gravity well, leaving it a charred, broken relic, Rauch assembled his cohort leaders in the muster bay to hear what the War Master would say. The transmission came as a cold pulse through Malith's warp links, a voice carried over distances that no mortal vox could span. It spoke in the low, implacable tone they all knew. One hunt remains. That was all. No acknowledgement of the worlds glassed. No comment on the utter destruction of the Cabal. No praise, no promise. No hint that they had moved even a pace closer to whatever ragged chance at standing before Abaddon again Malith's lies had dangled. The sorcerer's tail twitched, armor creaking. "Well," Vorath said into the silence, flexing his chain arms, dried blood cracking on their housings. "At least he is consistent." Hatred thickened in the air, like smoke. Not the hot, immediate rage they turned upon enemies in front of them, but a slow, grinding contempt for those who sat in pristine armor above, deciding fates with words while others paid in flesh. In the shadow of a shattered cathedral wall, away from the glaring muster bay lights, warriors of Night's Wound muttered to one another, voices low. "We could leave," one said. "There are other warbands, other masters, or none. The eye is wide. We have ships. We have teeth." "And what would we be?" another replied. "Without this leash, we are just another pack of scavengers. Better to bite the hand that holds the chain than to run with it still around our necks." Red iron gunners checked their weapons in silence, listening. Gilded ruin mask lenses reflected the bay lights in cool, appraising glints. Rauch heard none of the words, or he pretended he did not. But he felt the currents shifting. Ideas were like infection. Once they found a wound, they spread. The second hunt had shown them that even the most spectacular obedience earned only indifference. He turned his helm toward the void beyond the hull, where stars wheeled and the eye's distant storms flickered. "One more," he murmured to himself. "He says one more. Let us see what he truly means by that." The Oathbroken made ready to fall again, but in the dark between wars, something in them had begun to turn. The third hunt was meat, not the clean kill of a single world taken for demonstration, not the surgical excision of a Xenos excrescence. This was bulk slaughter, the kind of campaign where numbers ceased to mean anything after the first few billions had been ground into paste and smoke. Rauch Sable stood in the strategium of the Oathbroken's lead strike cruiser and listened to the subsector scream. The hololithic altar showed it in crude symbols and shifting color. A cordon of shrine worlds, hive worlds, and fortress moons strung like beads along the edge of the Black Crusade's advance. Each world burned with the ember glow of planetary bombardments. Icons marked the positions of Imperial Navy battle groups. Little golden shards pushed to the limit, their formation lines bowed and cracked under the weight of the oncoming storm. Beyond them, in deeper space, the Black Legion's armada gathered like a stormfront. Murder-class cruisers and ancient battle barges translated forward in waves. Demon engines slithered between them as crimson wounds in reality, their hulls more flesh than metal. Planet-killer platforms and repurposed macro forts drifted further back, their colossal guns aimed with unhurried malice. Between the fleets hung asteroids refitted as gun forts, their surfaces bristling with batteries. Some bore the aquila of the Imperium, others the defaced symbols of worlds that had already fallen and been turned against their former owners. Lance beams leapt from them in straight actinic lines, stabbing across light minutes to rake the void. Macro shells the size of hab blocks crossed the emptiness in slow, unstoppable arcs, some intercepted by point defense, others tearing through hulls and armor and crew compartments without ever knowing they had been noticed. On the worlds themselves, entire continents glowed with the steady light of macro battery barrages. Night and day lost their meaning under the constant flare of detonations. The ground shook in rhythms set by orbital calibers and planet-side artillery. Where once hivers had looked up to see stars, now they saw only falling fire. "This," Malithzar murmured beside Rauk, serpent tail coiled around a data spike, "is a meat grinder. The Imperium will feed it until the bones clog the teeth." "We are here to clear those teeth," Rauk said. Orders from the War Master had come as cold commands through the warp links, without preamble. The Oathbroken were to be unleashed across the subsector line, not as leading edge of a glorious charge, but as shrapnel fired into the worst of the existing wounds. "No pretty spearheads for us," Vorath Chiron chuckled from where he leaned on a support pillar, chain arms ticking restlessly. "No banners in the van. Just the holes no one else wants to crawl into." Chaos, for all its talk of freedom, was an efficient devourer. When warlords succeeded, the gods filled their cups until they spilled poison on everyone around them. When those same warlords faltered, they were not simply erased, they were kept, used, reshaped into tools that could turn failure into another kind of lesson. The Oathbroken had already served as executioners of traitors and saboteurs. Now they were being thrown where even traitor lords hesitated to tread. Not because their lives were worth more, but because their deaths would be particularly instructive. Abaddon had one more hunt to give them. He did not waste it on anything so simple as a single world. The first insertion came over a shrine moon whose name was lost in the overlapping Vox chatter. Imperial and Chaos forces had been tearing at each other there for many cycles by the time the Oathbroken fell from the sky. Defiled basilicas served as artillery emplacements. Processional causeways had been dug up to form trench networks. Flensed saints' statues used as anchor points for razor wire. The sky was a ceiling of smoke, illuminated from beneath by the constant flare of detonations. Rauk's drop pod slammed into a trench system that had already collapsed 3 times and been dug anew each time from collapsed bodies. The doors blew outward. The air hit him like a wall of grit and hot metal. Guardsmen in flak armor, their uniforms indistinguishable under layers of dust and blood, stared up at the black-armored giants emerging from the pod, the melee around them freezing for a heartbeat. Some of those men shouted in relief, seeing the 8-pointed stars only as a sign that someone was arriving to take the pressure off, the beleaguered line. Others recognized the lapis inlays, the patchwork armor, and felt their guts twist. The Oathbroken did not announce themselves. They moved. Rauk stepped over the wreck of a heavy stubber emplacement and began firing into the oncoming wave of Imperial troops and traitor militia alike, his bolter barking in controlled bursts that did not care whose aquila was painted on which breastplate. Red Iron set up their heavy guns on the backs of screaming men, boots grinding spines into the trench floor as they used the bodies as temporary firing platforms. "Forward," Rauk voxed. "We are not terrain. We are not their line. We are moving pressure." Behind the first inserts came more. Drop pods fell again and again, not concentrating on any one crisis point, but slamming into places where the casualty reports were highest. Overrun hab blocks on a hive world where the upper spires were already slagging off under lance fire. Breached void forts where defenders and boarders were still locked in hand-to-hand combat, their struggle hanging over the atmospheric void. trench labyrinths on fortress moons where artillery barrages had pulverized the ground to sludge. Everywhere they landed, the oath broken turned chaos into a new kind of pattern. On the hive world of Carthus Ultima, Lord General Karak Tanis learned their shape the hard way. He stood on the command bastion of what had once been the upper tier of a governor's palace, now a bunker punched through the carcass of a decapitated spire. Around him, his staff worked at half-ruined cogitator banks and improvised Auspex arrays. Autoquills scratched out casualty tallies that no one read anymore. The air tasted of ozone and incinerated concrete. Beyond the armor-glass viewport, his world was dying. The hives of Carthus had once towered into the clouds, each supporting a population in the low billions. Now they were smoking stumps and toppled shafts, their interiors exposed like snapped bones. Fire rivers ran down their sides where promethium had spilled. Macro shell impacts had carved great bites from their flanks. In the cramped arteries of their hab levels, clashes of armor and infantry could be heard even here, a dull, constant grinding noise. Enemy breach in lower districts confirmed, an Auspex officer reported, voice thin. Black Legion forces pushing up through mag rail tunnels. We are committing reserves. Her words trailed off as a new trace flickered across the display. It was not the usual signature of a drop assault. No neat pattern of staggered insertions. Instead, a scatter of blips thrown down with apparent indifference into the densest clusters of contact. "What is that?" Tanis demanded. The officer swallowed. "Unknown," she said. "Transponder codes match traitor Astartes, but the pattern is wrong. They are dropping inside both our lines and the main enemy spearheads." Tanis stepped closer to the viewport, as if he could shove his face through the reinforced glass and into the maelstrom outside. He saw them soon enough. In the choked canyon of a hab avenue below, where Imperial tanks burned and Chaos armor rolled over their carcasses, there came new streaks of fire from above. Pods slammed into rubble heaps and collapsed walkways, crushing whoever happened to be beneath them. Their doors spun away. From one, he saw a column of ragged black and gold armored figures spill forth. They were the size of any other Astartes, but their silhouettes were wrong, misshapen, limbs of different lengths. Some walked on asymmetrical legs, one organic, one a crude piston. Others swung arms that ended in chain housings instead of hands. Their armor was patched with different colors, old Legion hues showing through in painful flashes. They opened fire without hesitation on the nearest guardsmen and on the oncoming traitor marines trying to force the same choke point. Bolter rounds cut down both sides in equal measure. A Lehman Russ that had maneuvered into a good firing position found its supporting infantry obliterated by a heavy weapon burst that came from behind its flank. A moment later, a Black Legion Predator that had sought to swing into the same gap lost its turret to the same sudden, unaligned barrage. "Who are they?" Tanis whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "What side are they on?" They were not on any side that he understood. They were on an axis that ran perpendicular to his maps and allegiances. He watched as those black and gold cripples drove his men forward, literally shoving guardsmen into streets where overlapping fields of fire from their own heavy bolters would trap anything that stepped into view. When the Imperial line began to collapse, some of those maimed giants simply triggered melter charges on the supports of hab bridges, sending whole sections of building crashing down onto friend and foe alike, then walked through the rubble with bolters raised, finishing off whatever moved. Tanis felt something in him crack as he watched one of those giants seize a screaming trooper, pivot, and use the man's flak-armored body as a shield against a barrage of bolter fire. When the rounds had expended themselves in shredding meat and thin armor, the giant simply hurled the corpse aside and fired back. "Treason upon treason," he murmured. "No, that is not even treason. That is something worse." He did not have a word for it. The lexicon of imperial sin was broad, but this was not simply betrayal of oaths or worship of forbidden powers. This was a kind of weaponized contempt for the very concept of loyalty. It was a message written in blood for anyone on any side who thought they could trust a pattern. The Oathbroken used Imperial forces as wedges. They drove them into untenable positions, herding them along corridors and service tunnels with carefully managed patches of fire keeping them just ahead of black. Legion pushes until both streams of bodies poured into an intersection or chamber where the Oathbroken's own demon engines and massed bolters waited. There, they closed the teeth. Tanis listened to the Vox channels, heard his own officers snap contradictory orders, as some units reported supposed reinforcements. Others cried that they were being flanked by black armored monsters. He listened as screams cut off mid-word, as the withering static of overloaded channels took their place. In one hive, the pattern reached its logical conclusion. The city of Sanctum Tal, once a proud vertical labyrinth of shrines and hab blocks, housing more souls than most planets, had become a focal point for the subsector's defense. Its spires bristled with anti-orbital guns. Its cathedral tiers housed Munitorum dumps and command hubs. Its lower levels were a maze of manufactorum decks and worker warrens, where loyal and traitor forces had been slaughtering each other for so long that the walls bled. The Oathbroken did not assault it politely. They infested it. Drop pods punched into its upper towers first, disgorging kill cohorts into sanctified corridors and reliquary vaults. They overran defense hubs with brutal efficiency, slaughtering officers and adepts, seizing control of cogitator nodes and control relays. Malith Zar sank his warp tendrils into the city's machine spirits, feeling their pain and fury as they were forced to reroute power and control to unfamiliar claws. Red Iron, guided by Rauk's blunt tactical sense, moved to seize the primary power conduits that fed the city's void shields and macro batteries. They did not shut them down, they redirected them. Plasma torpedo stockpiles earmarked for launching at the Black Legion's ships were decoupled from their safety rooms and moved along new rails toward the structural hearts of the Hive's main support spires. Virus munitions, forbidden even by some Chaos Lords for their inherent capriciousness, were unearthed from deep, mag-sealed vaults. These were relic weapons, old tools of the Great Crusade that had been locked away by nervous priests who feared their indiscriminate hunger. The Oathbroken's tech thralls broke those seals with crude delight, ignoring the warnings in dead languages etched into their casings. Malith stood in a control chamber that overlooked the central shaft of Sanctum Tal. Below him, decks stacked upon decks fell away into darkness, pierced occasionally by the light of fires and falling debris. He could feel the heart of the Hive beating beneath his feet, a combination of reactors, recycling plants, and forgotten cult shrines all pulsing with stolen soul energy.
If you would like to support the channel, be sure to comment, like, and subscribe. Now let's get back into the video.
Detonation chain set, Red Iron reported. We can bring down all primary spires with a single sequence. Not yet, Rauk said. Wait until the meat is at its thickest. He drove Imperial and traitor forces alike toward the Hive's core. He directed Black Legion spearheads down certain routes with carefully leaked Vox information, letting them believe they had found weak points in the city's defense. He whispered false hope into the channels of Imperial commanders still clinging to parts of the Hive, letting them think that with one more push they could break out, link up with reinforcements, reclaim the main thoroughfares. That hope drove men and women into the same killing zones. When the arterial streets and central plazas were as clogged as they could be, when tanks and armored carriers and screaming infantry had filled every level of the main shaft, layer upon layer of bodies and metal already piled from previous clashes, Rauk gave the order. "Light it," he said. Malith smiled behind his mask and stroked the control room. The Hive's own munitions betrayed it first. Plasma torpedoes, slaved to new targeting cogitators, fired not outward but inward, their engines burning brief blue streaks through the confined spaces before their warheads blossomed. Whole sections of spire structure vanished in incandescent blasts, support columns ripped apart, spiraling stairwells vaporized. A heartbeat later, the virus bombs cracked open. Invisible clouds billowed through habdecks and manufacturing bays, slipping under doors, through vents, along transit rails. Flesh turned to liquid in an instant, organs melting, skin sloughing from bones. Those caught at the edges rotted where they stood, limbs collapsing into steaming puddles, lungs dissolving into froth that choked throats before the victims could scream. The city's ventilation systems did the rest, spreading the contagion deeper, wider, faster than any shells could have achieved alone. Sanctum Tal became a single column of diseased fire. From orbit, where Imperial and Chaos ships still traded blows, it looked like a new sun punching up from the surface, a pillar of flame that rose from the hive's heart and tore through the poisoned clouds above. Its base was a churning mass of burning buildings and vaporized corpses. Its apex split the upper atmosphere, scattering clouds and showering molten debris down on neighboring districts. Millions died in that single night, perhaps 1 billion. The numbers were meaningless at that scale. What mattered was that Sanctum Tal ceased to be any kind of fortress. It became a crater of smoking glass and contaminated ash, its void shields gone, its guns silenced. On a ridge of collapsed ferrocrete overlooking what had been the hive's central plaza, Rauk watched the pillar burn. His armor's filters scrubbed the worst of the viral residue from the air before he could breathe it in, but he could still taste something foul at the back of his throat, a cloying sweetness that clung to the senses. "You did well," Malith said beside him, tone almost conversational. "Efficient, thorough. The War Master will be pleased that you have proved so very adept at erasure." Rauk did not answer at once. He watched the fire chew upward, watched whole chunks of habdecks fall away, drawing screaming shapes with them. His augmetics picked up dying vox signals from buried command posts, prayers and curses cut off mid-word. "Does it matter?" he said at last. "Sanctum Tal is gone. The line cracks. The crusade advances. We have done what he asked, but each time we do, it feels less like a step toward anything and more like another shackle." Malith tilted his helm. "Enlightenment sits ill on you, Black Watch Captain," he said softly. "It makes you sentimental." Rauk turned to him. "You told them 3 hunts," he said. "You told them if they survived 3, the War Master might reconsider. You dangled that lie like a blade in front of their faces." "It was not wholly a lie," Malith replied. "He might reconsider. He might also decide that 3 is merely the number you needed to become properly broken." Rauk's voice was a low growl. "You have seen the ledger," he said. "You know the truth. Tell me." Malith considered, then sighed. "In the warp," he said. "Abstractions like oaths and promises take shape. The War Master has had me look at what gathers around the oath broken. It is not the pattern of a probation, it is the pattern of a warning sigil. A ward. Something he can show to his other warlords and say, look, this is what happens when you falter, when you try to run." Rauk's hand clenched on the railing until the metal groaned. "So, the 3 hunts were never a path back," he said. "Just a convenient count of how many times he could throw us into hell before the story grew tired." Malith shrugged, tail twitching. "Perhaps he will be surprised," the sorcerer said. "Perhaps you will do something that makes him reconsider. Perhaps you will simply keep killing until he finds a new use for your legend." Rauk looked back at the burning hive. Every life ending there, every soul torn free in terror and pain, seemed to him like another chain link welded around his own spirit. He felt no tug from any god promising reward, no whisper of elevation, only the cold certainty that he was becoming exactly what Abaddon wanted him to be, a monster whose only value was in proving how little mercy there was for failure. If there was no forgiveness ahead, then there was no reason to moderate his hate. In the collapsing districts around Sanctum Tal, the micro-wars continued. Cohort Knight's wound found themselves cut off in a half-fallen Hab sector when the first spire went up. They had been hunting pockets of loyalist resistance and survivors of the Cabal's old cells, amusing themselves by leaving fear totems in back alleys and vox curses that turned prayers into static. When the blast hit, 3/4 of the structures around them folded inward. Floors became walls, walls became ceilings. The air filled with dust and the grinding scream of metal on stone. They ended up in a cavern of wreckage that had once been a cluster of mid-level habstacks. Broken apartments spilled their contents into the space. Collapsed bunks, smashed shrines, bodies of families who had tried to shelter in place and been crushed instead. Knight's Wound picked themselves up from the rubble with the easy stubbornness of those who had survived worse. Their armor registered broken servos and ruptured plating. Ammunition counters ticked down to uncomfortable lows. Vox channels crackled with interference. They were not alone. Among the tangle of wreckage, squads of guardsmen and traitor militia alike had been dumped. Some were still alive, crawling from under beams and masonry, hauling each other free. Their uniforms were ripped, their weapons were lost or bent. They blinked in the dust-filled half-light, seeing shadowy power-armored shapes moving through the gloom and not knowing whether to raise their hands or their guns. Knight's Wound did not give them time to decide. They waded, in knee-deep in corpses, firing short, careful bursts where ammunition allowed, swinging blades and clubbing with weapon butts when it did not. When their magazines ran dry, they used the dead as shields, propping cooling bodies on rubble to block lines of fire. When they needed height, they climbed onto piles of corpses, boots slipping on slick uniforms, each step squeezing new fluids from ruptured organs. One warrior, his bolt pistol long empty, picked up a guardsman by the ankles and swung him like a flail, spines snapping as the body collided with traitor and loyalist alike. Another used a fallen trooper's laser gun, not as a firearm, but as a spear, jamming the barrel into screaming mouths, through soft eyes, levering the victims over edges to fall into the tangle below. They fought not for victory in that cramped space, but for spite, refusing to die under the same rubble as those who had pledged themselves to anyone else. When at last extraction came in the form of a cutting, beam from above, punching a narrow shaft down through the collapsed levels, there were no living mortals left in that hollow. Only Knight's Wound, their armor filmed in a paste of blood and dust, climbing out of a grave of their own making. Across the subsector, scenes like that repeated in infinite variation. World by world, the line crumbled. Fortress moons that had stood for centuries lost their void shields and were gutted from within. Shrine worlds saw their proud cathedra toppled and ground into the dirt. Hive cities burned, their dying columns of fire marking the steady advance of the Black Crusade across the star maps. The Oath Broken had been at the worst of it. Every time a report spoke of a breach where defenders and attackers alike vanished into sudden, deliberate annihilation, Rauch felt the echo of his cohort's passage. At last, on a nameless ridge above a shattered plain that had once been agricultural land and now was nothing but ash and bone, Rauch stood alone. For a moment, the sky above was a slow-turning maelstrom of smoke. The ground under his boots crunched with layers of pulverized bodies and burned soil. In the distance, wrecked tanks lay half-submerged in the grey sea, their hulls jutting up like the ribs of beached leviathans. No birds flew, no machines moved except those belonging to the Black Legion as they rolled forward into the next theatre, already forgetting this one. Rauch's augmetics had long since stopped trying to count the dead. The numbers had run past anything that even the most hardened warlord could make sense of. Dozens of worlds were now scarred in ways that would never heal. Billions of human lives, and uncounted others, had ended in this phase of the crusade alone. His cohort leaders' reports buzzed in the back of his mind. Casualty lists, armor status, ammunition levels. Each line another reminder that the Oath Broken were not edging closer to any promised absolution. They were simply becoming more effective at doing the sort of work that no one else wanted to be close to. He realized, standing on that mountain of ash and bone, that the third hunt had not been a test they could pass. It had been another proof that they were useful as monsters. If there was grace in their future, It would not come as a gift from above. It would have to be stolen. Rauk clenched his fists until damaged servos whined. "Enough," he whispered, though there was no one close enough to hear. "If we are only ever to be tools, then let us choose where we cut." The wind stirred the ash around him, lifting a grey veil off the bones beneath. Somewhere overhead, unseen through the clouds, the stars wheeled on in their indifferent courses. The Oath Broken gathered around their black watch captain, ready for whatever order came next, not yet knowing that the next war they would choose to fight would not begin with a drop onto someone else's world, but with a turn of their own guns. The Eye of Terror folded around the Oath Broken like a diseased womb. Their strike cruisers limped back into its depths, trailing wreckage and the last clinging ghosts of the subsector they had helped butcher. Warp storms licked at their hulls, tasting the fresh soul residue, then drew back, uncertain whether to devour or preserve. Demons drifted alongside like carrion fish, yellow eyes peering in through viewports, claws scraping against void shields. Within the flagship's gutted strategium, Rauk Sable called his pack to him. The chamber had once been a bridge worth hymns and heraldry, lined with polished adamantium and cogitator arrays. Now it was a hollowed-out skull of a room, ribs of broken support beams arcing overhead, consoles stripped to their bones. A single hololithic altar still functioned in the center, its projectors flickering, casting weak light over scarred plate and crude augmetics. Cohort leaders gathered in a rough circle. Red Iron's siege masters stood like hunks of ambulant scrap, hazard-striped bionics ticking. Gilded Ruin lounged with false nonchalance, masks gleaming, armor etched with new scars and sigils carved into the paint by fresh kills. Night's Wound lurked in the more shadowed corners, their ragged cloaks absorbing the dim light, the faint rasp of their vox projectors a constant undercurrent. Malith Zar floated a little apart, tail coiled, staff resting in his hand. Vorath Chiron stood close to Rauk, chain arms hanging loose, the dried remnants of the subsector's blood still flaking from their teeth. Rauk let the murmurs and grating chuckles settle. Then he spoke. "You all heard the War Master's last words," he said, his voice carried by internal vox and the simple weight of his presence. "One hunt remains, that was all. No more. Not even a lie about taking us back into his councils when we are finished." Gilded Ruin's leader tilted his masked head. "He has grown less verbose," he said dryly. "Perhaps the weight of his conquest tires his tongue." Rauk ignored the jibe. "He never intended to take us back," he went on. "Malith has seen the patterns. The oaths we swore hang in the warp like chains. Not the chains of a sentence to be served, but the sigil of a warning. We are not on probation. We are a lesson." Red Iron's champion snorted, the sound harsh through his damaged vox. "He has used us well as that lesson," he said. "We break worlds and shatter traitors, and he points to the wreckage and tells his pets, 'See what happens to those who fail.' Efficient." "Efficient," Rauk agreed, "and endless. There is no tally to be met, no number of hunts that will wipe the ledger clean. Every atrocity we commit only writes the story deeper. We are ammunition, not supplicants. No sacrament waits for us at the last, only more work or a bolt to the back of the head when he is bored." Silence settled like ash. Vorath broke it with a low laugh. "Then why have we been killing his enemies?" he asked. "Why did we tear down the Cabal? Why did we feed those imperial hives to the fire if all it did was polish his reputation and confirm our own chains?" Rauk turned his helm slightly toward him. "Because that was what was in front of us," he said. "Because we moved along the path we were pushed down. Because we did not stop to ask the obvious question." Night's Wound's leader stepped forward from the shadow, his skull trophies rattling softly. "And that question?" he asked. Rauk let the hololithic altar flicker to life. No world hung above it this time. Instead, a simple symbol rotated there. The 8-pointed star twisted in upon itself, its arms knotted into a shape that suggested both cage and snare. "Who do we want to be bleeding for?" Rauk asked. "If we are damned, then who deserves the taste of our last breath?" Vorath's chain housings purred as he flexed. "If we are already lost, the former world," Eta said, "then I say we stop dying tidily where some warlord points. I say we find something that makes the gods look up from their games. If we must be a warning, let it be one that cuts in every direction." Hatred burned in his words, but it was a different kind than before. Not the simple hunger for more skulls on a pile, but a desire to hurt those who had considered themselves above the reach of his rage. Malith's helm turned slightly. "You speak language that edges close to treason," the sorcerer said softly. "You suggest biting the hand that gave you back your limbs." "The hand gave us nothing," Vorath growled. "The forge worms bolted metal into us because they like toys that scream. The Warmaster gave us orders because he needed something expendable. The gods looked away the moment we stumbled. There is no hand, only knives." Rauk nodded. "Malith," he said, "tell them what you told me." The sorcerer's fingers tightened around his staff. Warp fire crawled along its length, reacting to the tension in its master's soul. "I am bound to the Warmaster," Malith said after a moment. "Through oaths, through marks, through the simple knowledge that he holds my name in his fist. I have enforced his will on your minds. I have tightened the chains when some of you pulled too hard against them. I will not pretend otherwise. But the same bindings that let me feel his command also let me feel the weight of the pattern he has laid over you." He raised one hand. Ghostly scripts fluttered in the air for a moment, sigils only half visible, their meaning more felt than seen. "He has woven you into the warp as an answer to a question," Malith went on. "That question is, what happens to those who fail? You are not a chapter to be redeemed, not a warband to be forgiven. You are a story that ends when you no longer serve as a useful threat. Until then, he will not waste you, but he will not raise you either." Knights, Wound murmured among themselves. Red Iron's leader spat a gob of congealed blood onto the deck where it sizzled faintly. "And you?" Gilded Ruin's champion asked. "What is your place in this charming composition?" Malith's tail twitched. "I was meant to be the chain that keeps you pointed the right way," he said. "But somewhere between the Xenos furnace and the meat worlds, your screams began to echo in my skull more than I intended. Spending so much time in the minds of broken things, some of it leaks." He looked back at Rauk. "This is folly," he said. "You know that. To turn against the Black Legion is to put your head in the wolf's jaws and hope he chokes." Rauk nodded. "Yes," he said. "That is why it will matter." In the warp around them, opportunities drifted past like wreckage. Some were obvious: Imperial convoys, rival warbands, demon incursions. Most were irrelevant to the Warmaster in the moment, beneath his notice. One, however, pulsed with a peculiar gravity. An Imperial Navy battle group, battered but intact, shepherding a flotilla of civilian vessels coreward. Refugee arks, pilgrim liners, requisitioned freighters stuffed to the deckheads with survivors from the collapsing subsector. Billions of souls crammed into ships never meant to hold so many, their life support systems straining, their holds thick with fear and recycled air. The Black Legion, in its pragmatic cruelty, had marked this exodus as a target, not because the people within posed any real military threat, but because they were witnesses. Letting them escape would mean their stories of the Crusade's progress would spread among other Imperial sectors. Better to burn them and let their absence be felt as one more nameless loss. Orders came down the chain. The oath broken would be translated into the battle group's path, to serve as a net, harrying and weakening the escort so larger chaos vessels could crush it. Rauk read those orders and saw a stage. "They want us to nip at their heels," he told his cohort leaders. "The hololith, now showing the projected path of the refugee fleet, its fragile arc cutting through a sea of warp sigils. "We will not." Red Iron's champion tilted his helm. "What then?" he asked. "We will not harry the convoy," Rauk said. "We will take it." Vorath's chains chimed softly as he laughed. "Boarding actions," he said. "Ship to ship, blood in corridors. No telling how many we can cut before the hulls come apart." Gilded Ruin's leader arched a shoulder. "And the Black Legion?" he asked. "They will see our change of pattern. They will ask why we did not follow orders. They will notice when you choose to make a spectacle where they wanted an erasure." Rauk looked to Malith. "That is where our sorcerer comes in," he said. Malith's helm dipped, slow. "The warp brand that ties you to Abaddon's sight runs through me," he said. "He will see the shape of your movement so long as that brand remains fixed where he left it. But with work, with pain, I can move it." He tapped his staff against his own breastplate. "I can take the mark into myself," he said. "Reroute the signal. From that point, when he reaches for the Oath Broken, he will find only me. Your exact movements will be blurred, your intentions hidden behind the noise of my suffering. For a time." "And the cost?" Night's Wound's leader asked. "If he chooses to tighten the leash," Malith said calmly, "it will close on my throat alone. If he chooses to rip it away, it will tear me apart. If he decides he is bored of this particular experiment, he may crush my soul like an insect and write the story off as an entertaining failure." He shrugged, as much as his armor allowed. "I have had worse bargains," he said. "At least this one is interesting." Rauk stepped forward, closing the distance between them. He placed one gauntlet on Malith's shoulder, the gesture halfway between a clasp and a brace. "You are certain," he said quietly. "When am I ever certain?" Malith replied. "But I am willing." Rauk turned back to the cohort leaders. "Here it is," he said. "A chance to choose our own hunt. Not to seek absolution. That dream is dead. But to carve something into the galaxy that is ours, not another line in the War Master's threat display." Red Iron's champion grunted. "Better than waiting for him to throw us into another grinder," he said. "I am in." Gilded Ruin's leader inclined his helm. "A fleet of desperate souls packed shoulder to shoulder," he mused. "The music of it will be complex. I will not miss that performance." Night's Wound's vox projectors hissed softly as their leader laughed. "Fear from hivers who thought they had escaped," he said. "I cannot deny the appeal." Vorath simply slammed his chain arms together in a clashing, sparking salute. "Point me at something that matters," he said. "If that something is also the source of my shackles, all the better." The Oath Broken moved to prepare for their most treacherous war. In the void beyond the eye, the Imperial battle group plowed through the darkness like a shepherd guiding a herd through a predator-rich forest. Battleships, cruisers, and escorts formed a shell around the convoy of slower freighters and liners, their auger arrays sweeping, their gun crews at constant readiness. They picked up the Oath Broken's cruisers as damaged silhouettes limping from an unseen engagement with other Chaos forces. Filters saw the black and gold hulls. Machine spirits felt the taint of the warp seared into their plating. It was enough to send alarms flaring through the command decks of the Imperial ships. Then the Oathbroken's vessels powered down their weapons and bled atmosphere and heat in choreographed spurts, mimicking catastrophic reactor damage. Distress signals in broken low Gothic and encrypted nonsense stuttered across the Vox, suggesting loss of command, mad machine spirits, uncontrolled drifts. Imperial admirals hesitated. Letting crippled Chaos ships drift unmolested was unthinkable. They could recover, regroup, strike at the convoy from behind. Destroying them at range was safer, but there was something about the pattern of the damage, the timing of the distress signals, that suggested an opportunity for intact hulls and valuable data. The battle group made its choice. Orders went out. A cordon of escorts moved to surround the crippled cruisers, weapons trained, while boarding torpedoes and assault boats ready to launch. Salvage parties, armsmen and stormtroopers filled to the teeth, prepared to tear whatever secrets they could from the gutted Chaos vessels. They did not expect those vessels to spit death back at them. At the moment when the Imperial ships committed their boarding craft, the Oath, Broken's cruisers came back to unnatural life. Dead engines roared, emission signatures flared, concealed batteries in ragged hull recesses opened up at spitting distance, vomiting lance fire and macro shells into the nearest escorts. Armor crumpled like paper. Compartments vented to the void. Whole decks turned to incandescent vapor. The Oath-Broken's ships surged forward on sudden bursts of thrust, ramming. Their prows punched into the hulls of Imperial cruisers, teeth of adamantium and demonic reinforcement tearing through void plating and bulkheads. Boarding clamps fired, grapnels tore gouges and then held, welding the ships together in ugly embraces. From their launch bays, instead of salvage craft, the Oath-Broken hurlers spat boarding pods and assault barges. They crossed the short distances between hulls in heartbeats, slamming into inner decks and gun decks, biting deep. The Imperium responded with drilled ferocity. Void armsmen and stormtroopers mobilized, pouring into corridors choked with smoke and emergency bulkhead alarms. They set up crossfires. They purged boarding points with flamers and disciplined volleys. They were not prepared for the kind of boarders they faced. Rauk's squad blew out into a starboard gun deck of an Imperial battleship, the breach haloed in still glowing metal. The air rushed out in a screaming gale, dragging stray objects and men toward the hole. Emergency shutters tried to slam down, grinding to a halt as Oath-Broken blades and bionics wedged them open. Half the compartment's atmosphere vented before void shields cycled. Men went with it, spinning into the black, their faces distorting as vacuum drank their breath. Those who managed to cling to gun housings and struts drew their sidearms with shaking hands, firing wildly at the dark shapes forcing their way in. Rauk stepped through the breach, magnetized boots clamping to the deck with purposeful thuds. His armor sealed tight. He moved through the thin, cold air as if it were nothing. His bolter barked, each shot a flare in the darkness, blowing bodies apart in red mist that froze and crystallized almost at once. Behind him came warriors with Xeno's lungs grafted into their ribs, organs stolen from tyrannid beasts that let them breathe poison and thin air with equal ease. They moved through areas where life support had failed without pause, stalking defenders who were weakened and coughing blood. Vorath found himself in a pressurized corridor where stormtroopers had formed a textbook kill box. Heavy stubbers at either end, overlapping fields of fire, choke points marked and covered. He grinned. The first salvo hammered into his chest and shoulders, driving him back a step, sparks flying. Plates buckled. Warning runes flared and died. He roared and charged anyway, chain arms spinning into life with a scream that cut through the storm of gunfire. He bounced off walls, using the recoil of impacts to slingshot himself forward. AI, limbless projectile propelled by rage and motors. Stormtroopers fired until their magazines ran dry, then died as his chain blades found them, cutting through carapace, bone and weapons alike. The corridor became a tunnel of flensing metal, walls painted with a new layer of red that steamed in the recycled air. Elsewhere, gilded ruin exploited the void. They moved in compartments where hull breaches gaped, dancing along the edges of flickering force fields. When power failed and shields flickered, the sudden gusts of vented air did not topple them. Their magnetized boots and preternatural grace kept them rooted. They watched voidsmen and officers alike flail as they lost footing, tumbling into walls or through sudden rents, and picked them off with leisurely shots or quick, precise cuts as they spun past. Night's Wound rigged decks with terror traps, not for aliens this time, but for humans who thought they understood fear. They cut power in certain sections, plunging them into pitch darkness, then used stolen vox codes to pipe in snatches of panicked orders, false alarms, the recorded death screams of comrades from other decks. Men ran toward what they thought were rally points and found only grinning skull masks and blades waiting. The boarding actions bled through every layer of the battle group's formation. Each captured weapon deck was turned against the fleet, firing at point blank into nearby escorts. Each seized communications node was used to spread confusion, sending contradictory orders, spoofed distress calls, pleas for surrender that led into ambushes. In the heart of one captured battleship, in a sanctum that had once been reserved for its Lord Captain and chosen remembrancers, Rauch stood before a Vox altar and spoke to a far greater audience. The chamber still held some trappings of imperial pomp. Paintings of ancient victories hung askew on the walls, their canvases scorched. A great aquila loomed over the main console, one wing broken. Rauch stood beneath it, his armor stained with the blood of the ship's officers, helm lenses glowing faint in the dim emergency lighting. Malith stood at his side, one hand pressed to the cracked Auspex display, eyes closed behind his mask. Warp fire crawled over his fingers, threads of it vanishing into the battered cogitator banks, insinuating themselves into the ship's broadcasting systems. "I have a path," Malith murmured. "It will carry your words into the warp currents. They will reach him. They may reach others." Rauch nodded once. "Do it," he said. Malith hissed an invocation and ripped. For a moment, the brand that Abaddon had placed upon the oath broken flared in Rauch's chest, the rune over his heart burning as if freshly applied. Then it moved. Pain like a spear drove through his ribcage and into Malith's outstretched palm. The sorcerer convulsed as the chain of warp script altered its anchor point, sliding from Rauch's soul into his. He screamed as it settled. The sound was raw and real, cutting through all pretense. For a heartbeat, the warp itself seemed to recoil as Malith's essence twisted around the new weight. Then it settled, concluding that this too could be born. When he opened his eyes again, their glow was brighter, edges tinged with the color of the brand. "He will look for you and find me first," Malith panted. "I can make it difficult for him to see past me. Not forever, long enough." "Long enough," Rauch repeated. He stepped forward, leaning his hands on the Vox altar. He did not bother with formalities, no titles, no invocations meant to flatter. "Warmaster," he said, voice carried along channels, both material and immaterial, through the battle group's internal systems, out into the void and beyond into the hungry, watching warp. "This is Rauch Sable, Black Watch Captain of the Oath Broken, your broken hounds." He let the words hang for a heartbeat, then continued. "You marked us as a warning. You used us as knives. You promised us nothing and gave us less. We have seen your enemy's blood and our own spilled in your name. We have ground worlds into ash, shattered traitors, burned hives full of meat, and still you hold us at arm's length, useful but never worthy." He drew in a breath, the sound rasping through his vox. "No more. You told us one hunt remained. We choose it." He gestured out, though no one outside the chamber could see. "This battle group," he said, "these refugee ships, they are our hunt. We will not harry them as you commanded. We will break them in our own way. We will make a pyre that even you cannot pretend not to see." His helm dipped slightly. "You will call this defiance," he said. "You will call it treason. Perhaps it is. But we will show you that even your broken, shamed tools can still decide where to bite. Remember that, the next time some favored lord considers running from your displeasure. Remember that there is nowhere in this galaxy that your hounds will not turn if they are abused long enough." He cut the transmission there, before anger could drown him. Malith sagged, leaning on his staff, the brand in his soul pulsing. "He heard," the sorcerer said hoarsely. "Oh, he heard." There was no immediate thunderbolt from the warp, no sudden constriction of their hearts, no psychic hammer blow obliterating them. Distance and the complexity of larger wars stayed Abaddon's hand for the moment, or perhaps he simply watched, curious to see how his toys would break. On the human side, the Oathbroken's intentions became clear in simpler ways. They did not sit back and let their captured decks bombard the refugee convoy from afar. They closed. Assault boats and breach torpedoes slammed into the hulls of packed pilgrim ships and mass conveyors. Their outer plating was never designed to resist such deliberate attack. Hulls ruptured, bulkheads buckled, the oath, broken, poured in. They found corridors jammed with people, men, boys, ancient priests, pressed together in a crush of fear and tiredness, clutching what little they had salvaged from burning worlds. They found holds where hivers had built temporary shanties from cargo crates and tarps, families stacked in bunk tiers that left barely room to breathe. They killed them. They did it methodically, not in wild rage. Bolter fire worked its way down lines of bodies like harvesters in a field. Those too far to shoot immediately died when atmosphere failed, sucked into space through ruptured hulls. Others were trampled under panicking feet as the Oathbroken advanced, boots grinding ribs, necks and spines. In one transport, Night's Wound cut the lights and walked down a central promenade in total darkness, their mask lenses flaring faintly. Their vox projectors played quiet hymns in broken, backwards high Gothic, confusing terrified ears. When someone lit a candle or a lumen, its weak glow caught on a skull helm for a heartbeat before the bearer stepped aside, leaving only the image to burn in the witnesses' minds in the instant before bolter fire stitched through them. Gilded ruin moved among the refugees like spectres, their exquisite masks reflecting the contorted faces around them. They carved their sigils into bulkheads and support struts, into the few pieces of ornamentation that had survived the flight from the subsector. They did not bother taking slaves or trophies. There was nothing here worth the wait. Red Iron found the engine decks and life support hubs and wrecked them, not with the crude finality of melter bombs, but with the perverse precision of true siege masters. They ensured that systems would fail slowly, one by one, turning each ship into a coffin that took its time suffocating its contents in cold and dark. Malith spread the vision of this slaughter outward. He reached into the vox feeds of the Imperial battle group, let the sound of the killings bleed into open channels. He ensured that every remaining ship heard the screams from its neighbors. He opened pict blisters and let them broadcast flickering images of black armored cripples moving through panicked crowds, their bolts and blades working with terrible calm. In command sanctums, officers watched the destruction of the fleet they had sworn to protect and understood that this was not a simple act of war. It was a declaration. When, at last, the Oathbroken were done, the refugee flotilla was no longer a coherent thing. Some ships were burning, their spines broken by internal explosions. Others drifted cold, their lights out, their holds full of frozen statues. A few, gutted of human life but still structurally sound, had been turned into impromptu torches, their atmospheres pumped full of combustibles and ignited, turning them into tumbling pillars of flame. From a distance, the formation looked like a field of dying stars. Rauk stood in the viewing blister of his flagship and watched the convoy come apart. Behind him, Malith's labored breathing filled the silence. The brand in his soul throbbed, reacting to the attention of the distant Warmaster, like a wound reacts to probing fingers. Abaddon knew. Abaddon saw. What he would do about it was a future problem, coiled like a serpent in the dark. For now, the present burned. Rauk opened his external vox, patched into every channel he could reach. Imperial, chaos, the weak, panicked broadcasts of the dying. He did not scream. He did not roar. He spoke in the same low, implacable tone he had used when reciting oaths, and the galaxy heard him. "We are the Oathbroken," he said. "We are Deathwatch no longer. We are the Hunt." The message from the Warmaster came as a cold pressure in Malithzar's skull. No vox burst. No runes on some mortal's screen. Just the sudden weight of a will that had bent legions and broken primarchs, settling like a hand on the back of his neck. In the strategium of the strike cruiser, the sorcerer stilled. Witchfire that had been idly crawling along his staff drew inward, gathering around his helm like a crown of sullen embers. Rauk Sable felt the change, as a sour note in the data streams that flowed through his own dead sockets. He has noticed, Malith said quietly. Rauk stood at the viewing blister, helm in place, looking out into the roiling madness of the eye. Warp storms clawed at the ship's shields with talons of coloured lightning. Great eddies of unreality rolled past, carrying the echoes of distant wars and older sins. He noticed when we carved those refugee ships open, Rauk said. He noticed when I spoke in his direction. The question was never if, only what he would do with that knowledge. Malith's fingers clenched on his staff. He offers a hunt, the sorcerer said. A last one. His words taste like iron and poisoned honey. Rauk turned, facing him fully. Speak, them, he said. Malith closed his eyes for a heartbeat, then let the War Master's intent roll through him and out. There is a system, he said, voice lowered, resonant with something that was not entirely his. On the torn edge of the Great Rift, a place where reality has grown thin, where a gate is being born, a wound in space that could be shaped into a corridor through the madness, a road for fleets. Or it could be left to gnaw at the stars until it widens and swallows them. Hololithic projectors flickered half awake around them in response to his words, as if the ship itself were trying to display something its sensors could not truly see. A star map wavered, then warped, the usual neat webs of lanes and markers bending around a dark smear that glowed faintly blue at the edges. Imperial expeditions have gone there, Malith continued. Xenos Craftworld scouts, Orc roving fleets, even some of our own demon ships. None returned, only screams and static bleed from that region when the currents are right. The War Master has had his eye on it for some time. Rauk's helm tilted, the scarred brand over his heart's aching as Abaddon's distant interest brushed it. And now? Rauk asked. Now he sees use for a broken knife, Malith said. He sends us as a test piece. If we die accomplishing nothing, he loses tools already half spent. If we open the way, he has a path for crusades to come. If we collapse it in the attempt, then he will have seen what happens when he points his curse at an impossible target. Rauk stood in silence for a long moment. Around them, the ship creaked and muttered as its wounded machine spirit argued with the warp outside. He does not try to drag us back to heel, Rauk said at last. He does not send a Reaver fleet to cut us apart. He sets the board and pushes us across it. Even his punishments are campaigns, Malith murmured. We are not important enough to kill simply. We are important enough to throw at something that has already devoured better than us. In the age of unending war that had swallowed the 41st millennium, battles that killed billions were sometimes only footnotes in larger designs. Whole campaigns existed to nudge the balance of power by a fraction, to open or close some corridor in the warp, to amuse a god. The grand narratives of crusade and counter-crusade were tapestries woven from threads that most of the warriors bleeding for them would never glimpse. The Oathbroken had butchered hive worlds, shattered traitor legions, massacred refugee fleets. Each time, they had thought of themselves as the blade in someone's hand. Now, they learned they had been a pawn all along, moved to a square where even their destruction could draw a useful line on some unseen chart. Rauk turned back to the warped star map. "Show me," he said. Malith's staff tapped the deck. The flickering smear of the Riftgate system coalesced into something like an image. A star, bloated and pale, its corona stripped and stretching into a spiral. Around it, the emptiness thickened, not with debris but with absence. A ring of not light, a bruise in space, hung where a planet might once have orbited. At its edges, distant luminaries seemed to bend, their light pulled and twisted. "It eats suns," Malith said, slowly. "The gate is not finished. It is a half-healed wound. Something pushes from the other side. Something drags." Vorath Chiron's vox chimed as he entered the strategium, chain arms ticking against his sides. "Sounds worthy," the former World Eater said, listening to the echo of Malith's projection. "Better than another meat world, where only the numbers impress. A gate that kills stars." that is a throat worth cutting our teeth on. Rauk watched the image devour itself on the hololith, the pseudo-sun's corona drawn ever inward, eaten by the dark ring. "Prepare the cohorts," he said. "Tell them the War Master has given us a last hunt. He wants us to open a path through hell. We will oblige him. In our way." The journey to the Rift Gate system began like any other plunge into madness. The strike cruisers and patched-together escorts of the Oath Broken aligned their battered prows with the coordinates Marlith teased from Abaddon's message. Geller fields flared to working strength. Warp drives chanted their agonized hymns. Runes flickered from red to a color that meant neither safe nor doomed, only committed. "Translation," intoned the Magos through Vox and Servo chime. "Reality breach initiated. Emperor not acknowledged." The eye rose around them, swallowing the last glimpse of the material stars. For a time, the ships rode familiar currents of unreality, storms they had charted through ordeal. The walls hummed. Shadows stretched. Demons pressed their faces to the membranes of reality and watched, drooling. Then things began to break. First, time staggered. Rauk felt conversations repeat, words he had just spoken hanging on his Vox again, slightly altered, a half-beat out of sync. He turned his helm and saw Vorath at his side, then saw him again a step behind where there should have been no one. Servitors walked through the same door twice without leaving. Bolter shells ejected from a test fire reinserted themselves into magazines. "Brace!" Malith hissed from the nave, where he had installed himself as a human-shaped warding totem. "We are already within its shadow. The gate is not just ahead, it is leaching back along the path." Next, space folded. Through the viewing blister, Rauk saw his own ship, hull scars and all, sliding alongside them, where no parallel vector existed. The twin vessel's armor was blackened as if by some great heat, its viewports dark. For a moment, across that short, impossible distance, he saw himself staring back, helm lenses, twin pits of red. Then the other ship flickered as if someone had blinked the world, and it vanished. Other shapes appeared and disappeared. Fleets in old markings, great Crusade-era hulls, sleek and proud. Rusted convoys bearing the sigils of legions long dissolved. Imperial cruisers with pristine paint and unsullied heraldry, gliding through the warp without scars. All passed in an instant, then were gone, leaving only the afterimage of their wake on the augurs. Dead brothers walked the corridors. Vorath turned a corner and came face to face with a warrior in blue and white warplate, the old colors of the World Eaters, helm crest bright, chain axe in one living hand. For a heartbeat his heart lurched, some buried shard of loyalty twisting. Then he realized the warrior was himself, as he had been before the gods tired of mending him. The other Vorath grinned with all his teeth, eyes bright. "Still running?" he asked. "Still chasing a worthy kill like a starving hound?" Vorath roared and swung his chain arms. They passed, through the apparition like smoke. The image laughed, then dissolved into a spray of red motes that soaked into the deck. Elsewhere, Rauk heard the clank of familiar steps and turned to see members of his old claw, men whose deaths he had recorded on campaigns long past, walking alongside current Oath Broken, as if they had always been there. They blinked out when he tried to tag their armor signatures, diminished to ghost echoes in his implants. Malith fought to keep the ship's sanity intact. He wove wards from the souls they had butchered, the weight of their combined deaths hammered into glyphs and barriers, layers of psychic grease smeared across the hulls, letting the worst of the rift gates pull slide rather than seize. He pulled on every oath the Oath Broken had sworn, every moment of their defiance, and turned it into a kind of anchor. "It wants to show us everything we could have been," he snarled into the warp winds, his staff blazing. "Every path, every failure, every victory we never won. We will not be lured by ghosts." The Rift Gate system did not appear on the Auspex so much as erupt into being. One moment, The warp tossed them in a sickening parody of navigation. The next, the Royal pulled back like a curtain, and there was a star. It was sick. Its light was the color of bruises, its surface seething with slow storms. Great arcs of plasma stretched outward, not in the usual graceful loops, but in lines that bent and broke as if hitting invisible walls. Space around it was warped, the star's own mass and the strain of the gate's birth tearing at the fabric of reality in competing directions. The gate ring hung where a planet should have been. It was not a solid construct. It was absence shaped into a loop, outlined by a thin edge of pale blue that hurt to look at directly. Within the circle, stars bent and vanished, as if a lens were being ground there from nothing. At its edges, flares from the six suns struck and were swallowed, their energy dragged inward and down. Debris drifted, frozen in unnatural orbits. Hulks of ships that had come before, imperial, chaotic, Xenos silhouettes warped by their proximity to the gate. Some were torn in half, their exposed innards sparkling with leaking atmospheres. Others were twisted into knots, hulls braided around themselves like broken spine bones. The system was quiet. No vox calls, no engine murmurs, just the background groan of the tear itself, a constant subsonic thrum that vibrated through hulls and teeth. "This is not a battlefield," Gilded Ruins leader said softly over the command channel. "This is a graveyard that has not finished digging." "It is both," Malith said, "and we are to be the last shovelfuls before the marker is set." He felt the War Master's attention reach this far, a distant weight on the link lodged now in his own soul. Abaddon watched through him, not guiding, not intervening, but observing like a player whose piece had reached the far side of the board. "Drop coordinates," Rauk ordered. "We land on the ring itself." There was no planetary surface to ground upon, only the fractured constructs of the half-formed gate. The Oath Broken launched in dropcraft and gun cutters, engines screaming as they threaded paths through fields of twisted wreckage. The closer they flew to the ring, the more reality flexed. Instruments spun, reading multiple positions at once. Vox echoes returned words before they were spoken. They broke through, forcing their craft down onto segments of the gate's structure where enough solidity remained to bear their weight. The ring was not entirely intangible. Somewhere, deep within, something like machinery had grown. What they touched down upon was a surface of black stone and metal that might have been older than humanity, cracked and bleeding pale light from its fissures. Geometric patterns crawled across it like migrating scars, shifting and reconfiguring faster than the mind could comfortably follow. The moment their boots hit it, the gate began to defend itself. Shapes rose from the surface, coalescing from the bruised light. They took form as they came, resolving into figures that made the Oathbroken's gun servitors hesitate for a heartbeat. They were people, guardsmen in torn flak armor, laser guns held in white-knuckled grips, traitor marines in colors of legions they had been ordered to cleanse, mortals in pilgrimage robes, clutching children that were made of warp mist and old regret, black legionnaires in perfect warplate, laughing behind sealed helms, faces the Oathbroken recognized, not specific individuals perhaps, but types, roles, the sum of every life they had stepped on, burned, used, discarded. The first of these wraiths reached for Rauk, lips moving soundlessly. He shot it in the sternum. The bolt passed through, blossoming in an explosion that tore open the surface of the gate behind the apparition, but did nothing to its borrowed flesh. These were not enemies to be killed in the simple way. They were accusations. A guardsman with half his face melted from a virus bomb they had set, staggered toward Night's Wound, hands outstretched. Another, in the ragged habit of a Shrine City preacher, screamed voicelessly in Rauk's grill. The air thickened with their presence, cloying and cold, slowing limbs, dragging at hearts. "Not real," Vorath snarled, though his voice trembled with something like nausea. "Not real." He charged anyway, Chain limbs roared as he hurled himself into the densest knot of phantoms. Teeth met phantom flesh and bit, shredding forms that dissolved into streaks of blue light and the smell of old incense. Each cut sent a sting up his arms, a jolt that stabbed directly into the scars of his memory, but he did not stop. "Come on then," he bellowed, voice cracking. "I have carried you long enough. Time for you to carry me." For every phantom he tore apart, two more rose in its place. Not all were human. Tyrannid screamer killers, whose spines still bore the marks of his blades, lunged at him, bodies half transparent. Orc knobs with cracked jaws, caught mid-laugh, swung ghost choppers at his head. The Cabal Lord whose skull he had once crushed under his boot stalked toward him, helm restored, eyes burning with balefire. Vorath laughed in their faces, because the alternative was to listen to the whispers that rode on the psychic wind. "You left us. You used us. You forgot us." The fighting became a blur of steel and spectres. Red iron fired into the crowds, their shells tearing chunks from the gate's fabric, even when they passed through their ghostly foes. Gilded ruin moved with desperate precision, targeting not the phantoms' bodies, but the anchor points in the gate's skin where their feet seemed to connect, severing those links. Night's wound broadcast terror frequencies that mixed with the emotional echoes of the apparitions, warping their forms into contorted parodies that faltered, then snapped. Malith moved among them, not with his body, but with his mind. He saw the phantoms for what they were, the gate's immune system, made from the refuse of those who had died feeding it. Every sin, every betrayal, every death that had occurred anywhere near its influence had become ammunition for its defense. He reached into the tide and seized a clutch of those echoes, pressing them together, forcing them to feed on one another instead of on his warriors. Guardsmen who had died under friendly bombardment found themselves confronting officers who had ordered the fire. Traitor Marines faced the men they had executed. Black Legionnaires whose laughter had once rung down a forged deck felt their mouths filled with the ashes of the apprentices they had mocked. For a few precious heartbeats, the phantoms turned upon themselves. "Now!" Malith gasped into the vox. "The heart!" Forward! At the center of the ring, where the irreal light was brightest, a structure rose. It was nothing so simple as a tower or a fortress. It was a knot in reality, a tangled mass of geometry that defied the eye. Angles that should not meet did so. Planes folded into themselves. It hurt to look at, even through helm lenses. "That is where it thinks," Malith said. Vorath Chiron did not wait for a more elaborate explanation. He led the charge. Chain limbs tearing themselves apart with every impact. Plates peeling, housings cracking. He hurled himself straight at the knot. Phantom claws raked his chassis, leaving wounds in the air that bled colors he had no words for. Voices screamed in his ears. The voices of the dead he had fed into his god's altars. The voices of brothers he had abandoned. The voices of enemies he had killed too quickly. He drove on, shrieking wordless defiance. Teeth spun. Metal screamed. For an instant, his world narrowed to the feel of resistance under his blades, something between flesh and stone. It was like cutting into gristle that went on forever. His chain arms burned, motors overloaded, cables snapped. One arm blew apart up to the elbow, showering him in shards. He switched his weight, drove the other deeper, ignoring the alarms in his armor, the pain in his ruined stumps. In that moment, he understood something terrible and perfect. There was nothing for him beyond this. No ascension, no reward, no quiet place beside a god's throne. His entire existence had been a series of charges into one impossible wall after another. This one was just more honest about how it would kill him. He laughed, and the sound was almost joyous. "I am alive," he said through gritted teeth, as the last of his chain teeth sheared away under the strain. "I am alive." The gate flinched. Rauk saw the ripple spread from the point where Vorath's charge connected. The knot of unreality pulsed. Lines of force, shivering. For a heartbeat, The ring's devouring of the sick sun faltered. It was not enough. The gate shored itself, drawing deeper upon the currents it rode. It began to drag with renewed hunger, trying to suck the oath broken into its non-mouth, to grind them into new ghosts. Rauk opened a private channel to Malith. "Now," he said, "there will not be a second opening." Malith stood at the boundary of the knot, staff planted, warp fire flaring around him. His armor steamed. The brand in his soul was a burning coal, the Warmaster's attention pressing against it hard enough to crack. "He wants this path," Malith whispered. "He wants us to open it, to stabilize the wound so his fleets can march through like a parade." "We will deny him," Rauk said, "and everyone else. This thing eats whatever it touches. We give it too much, it will grow. We give it the wrong kind, it may choke. Can you do it?" Malith looked into the heart of the gate and saw infinity stitched with hatred. "Yes," he said, "if I go with it." Rauk's silence was assent. The sorcerer stepped forward. He let his wards fall, one by one. He unspooled the chains he had wrapped around the oath-broken souls, letting their echoes float free for the first time in years. He took the Warmaster's brand, that knot of script and malice anchored in his essence, and unwound it carefully, as if disarming a bomb. It writhed, tried to lash back to its creator, but Malith bound it with loops of his own name, wrapping it tight. Then he pushed himself into the gate. Not his body. That would follow soon enough, burned and broken along with everything else. His mind, his spirit, his identity. He flung forward into the knot of unreality, taking the brand with him. For an instant he hung there, stretched between Abaddon's distant hand and the gate's devouring maw. He thought of the oath broken, of Rauk's stubborn defiance, of Vorath's laughter in the face of hopeless wars. He thought of the refugee ships burning, of Sanctum Tal's ascension, of the Xenos furnace and the Cabal's execution, each atrocity a layer of filth that had blackened their story. "Forget us," he prayed, though he did not know to whom. "Let us be a smudge in your annals. Let our names erode." The gate bit down. Malith became a conduit. He channeled the brand like poison into the gate's core, feeding it Abaddon's mark, not as a command, but as contamination. He dragged with him the psychic residue of every horror he had witnessed through the oath-broken's eyes. Hive worlds burning, traitors screaming as their cowardice looped forever, refugees dying in dark corridors. The gate gagged. It was not made to digest such concentrated spite, such knotted paradox. Its purpose was to connect, to draw, to open. Malith forced it to swallow something that wanted only to ruin. Rauk felt the change as a shudder under his boots. "Cohorts," he voxed. "Hold." They held, on a surface that was no surface, fighting phantoms with blades and fists, while reality trembled. Red iron anchored themselves with grapnels driven into cracks that appeared and vanished beneath them. Gilded ruins stood in balanced stances on shifting lines, faces serene behind nailed masks. Night's wound howled fear at the onrushing apparitions, not to break them now, but to give themselves something to hear besides the roar of the collapsing gate. The rift gate began to implode, not in the simple way of an explosion's aftermath, where debris falls inward to fill a void. This was more like a concept deciding it no longer wished to exist. The ring's edges curled. The stolen light at its circumference flared, then flickered out segment by segment. The space within cinched tight, folding ever smaller, eating itself. The sick sun screamed. There was no sound in vacuum, but every sensor and every nerve in the system felt it. The star convulsed as the gate's feeding path snapped. Plasma streams that had been dragged into the ring whipped free, lashing out in wild arcs. Some struck the ring's disintegrating skeleton, sending gouts of energy rippling along it. Others sprayed into space, birthing storms of high-energy particles that shredded nearby hulks and ships like tissue. The oath broken were caught on the gate's skin as it folded. Pieces of them went with it. Warriors whose boots were too well magnetized found themselves dragged along as surfaces inverted, pulled into angles that narrowed to nothing. Others were simply torn apart by the conflicting vectors of force, armor ripped from limbs, limbs from torsos, torsos from heads. They did not break formation. They fought until their weapons shattered, until their fingers broke, until there was nothing left to swing. Vorath disappeared in the blaze, still laughing, still driving whatever was left of his arms into the knot. His last sensation was of being very, very small, in the teeth of something that was finally big enough to match his appetite. In orbit, the Oathbroken's ships died as they had lived, stubborn and ugly. Shockwaves rippled outward from the gate's death throes, shredding hulls, collapsing Geller fields, letting warp bleed in roar. Demon engines that had prowled the system for a taste of whatever emerged were caught in crossing streams of unreality. Their flesh and metal unraveled into flocks of screaming birds that never quite formed. Imperial wrecks, Xenos hulks, the remnants of long-lost fleets, all were ground together in the collapsing knot of space. Campaigns that had struggled across sectors, only to end here without witnesses, were erased a second time, their last markers smeared away. For a span that could not be measured in normal increments, there was only light and darkness tearing at one another. Then, as quickly as a switch being thrown, there was nothing. No star, no gate, no wreckage. The Riftgate system had become a scar, a place where instruments read only absence, where navigators felt their third eyes ache and turn away. A dead zone in the warp, a pocket of almost silence in a howling galaxy. In that silence, in the dark that followed, something small drifted, a gauntlet, its fingers locked around an invisible throat in one last frozen killing grasp. Black armor, lapis trimmed, gold scratched and scorched. The mark of the oath broken burned into the back of the hand, its lines cracked, some points flaked away. It tumbled end over end in the void, weightless, no longer attached to any arm, any warrior, any oath. No one saw it, no one reached to catch it. It spun on, alone at the edge of eternity, until even the memory of the hand that had worn it faded from the dreams of gods. It began as a rumor in the data. Decades after the refugee fleet died screaming in the dark, the Imperium was still picking bone fragments from its teeth. In the vaults of the Ordo Xenos and the Ordo Malleus, in chambers where stasis caskets full of heretical artifacts sat beside cogitator banks, humming with forbidden records, men whose job it was to catalogue nightmares watched corrupted pict feeds and tried to name what they saw. Lord Inquisitor Halbrecht, older now, face scored with new scars and grey at the temples, stood in a viewing amphitheatre wrapped around a hololithic well. Around him, interrogators and savants sat at their terminals, fingers flickering over room keys, eyes reflecting ghostlight. In the well, a battleship died again. The recording was fragmentary, recovered from a single black box that had tumbled through space until some patrol had trawled it from a debris field. The image jittered, blurred by radiation and warp bleed. It was enough. They saw the boarding. Black and gold giants forced their way onto the gun decks, armor patched and ugly, limbs misaligned. They watched limping figures with chain housings where arms should be stride through, smoke, firing on anything that moved. They saw the corridors choked with refugees and the giants wading among them with calm, methodical brutality. The sound was worse. Screams layered over shouted orders, the crack of bolters, the hollow clang of boots on deck plating. Some of the voices on the recording still had names in the inquisitorial archives. They had sent distress calls that never reached anyone with the power to help them. Halbrecht listened in silence, thumb running along the edge of the rosette at his throat. Some in the conclave insist it was Deathwatch, said a voice at his side. Lord Inquisitor Damar of the Ordo Malleus stood there, a tall, ascetic man with a face like a carved icon. His armor was black and silver, purity seals layered thick over the plates. every parchment strip bearing wards written in his own cramped hand. Radicals, Damar went on. A kill team driven mad by proximity to the Xenos and to the demon. They see the black armor, the surgical brutality, and they think they recognize their own tools gone bad. And you? Halbrecht asked. Damar watched as one of the crippled Marines on the recording used a stormtrooper as a shield, then discarded the corpse when it had served its purpose. The lines are wrong, he said. The heraldry, such as it is wrong. Those chain-limbed things move like men who have been broken and hammered back into something that can still stand. That is not how the Deathwatch looks, even in its darkest hours. He paused. There are accounts, he said slowly, from long-range augur sweeps. Reports of a penitent force within the Black Legion. Cripples sent to die where others will not go. No records we can trust, of course. No proofs. Just whispers. Halbrecht nodded. Whispers are where our work begins, he said. We will not name them yet. That would give them a form they do not deserve. For now, they are the crippled Deathwatch, a shadow we will cast into briefings to remind our own that the enemy learns from us even as it mocks us. He looked up as the recording reached its end. The last image was of a gauntlet, black and lapis and gold, closing around the picked unit's lens before the feed cut to static. Find everything you can, Halbrecht said. Every echo, every rumor. There is a story here, and stories are weapons. Far from any inquisitorial vault, in a place no human map admitted existed, Abaddon the Despoiler watched his own vision of the same wound. He sat upon his throne of broken relics, armor dark and still, the talon on his right hand flexing idly. Before him, in the smoke-filled air of his command sanctum, a warp scrying shimmered. It did not show the massacre of a refugee fleet. That had been a small thing, hardly worth the attention of a warlord with whole sectors on his mind. It showed the death of a system. In the scrying, the malformed sun of the rift gate bloated, spasmed, and went out. The ring of absence cinched tight, folding in upon itself. Fleet shadows, Imperial, Xenos and his own, were drawn in, crushed, unmade. Then came the silence, a hole burnt in both real space and the immaterium, a scar of non-being amid the madness. His lieutenants had yelled for retribution when word of the Oathbroken's defiance first reached them. They had demanded the chance to lead fleets into the eye, to hunt down the crippled curs who dared speak too loudly. Abaddon had listened, then ignored them. He watched now as the dead zone settled, its edges flickering, then hardening. Navigators would feel it as a blind spot, a place their third eyes refused to look. Astropaths would find their calls skirting an invisible edge. Supply lines, already tenuous, would have to bend around this new absence. It was an inconvenience for the Imperium. It was a problem for his rivals, whose routes through the greater galaxy were fewer and more desperate than his own. It was, in the long ledger of the Long War, a useful hurt. Their last snap, Abaddon murmured, almost to himself. A broken jaw can still take a piece of flesh if you stick your hand in at the right moment. He did not smile. Satisfaction for him was never so crude as a grin. It was the lazy ease with which he dismissed the question of follow-up. What of them? Asked a dark apostle at his side, chain of scripture wrapped around his neck. Shall we send hunters? Make an example? Abaddon's gaze did not move from the fading image of the dead system. I already did, he said. They made it themselves. He let the scrying fade entirely, light collapsing into a single point, then vanishing. There are other wars, he said. Let the story of the Oathbroken spread. It will do more work than any fleet I could waste on chasing ghosts. And spread it did. In the eye of terror, where reality boiled and histories slid against one another like sheets of broken glass, tales mutated, faster than flesh. The story of the War Master's crippled Deathwatch, his black watch of maimed failures, went from warband to warband in bartered voxcants, and shouted boasts on demon world killing grounds. Some told it as a cautionary tale. Priests in rusted armor, dark apostles, and their equivalent monstrosities in other legions pointed toward the drifting hulks that still orbited certain demon worlds, hulks that had once carried the oath broken to war. Serve well, they told snarling aspirants and cocky champions, or the War Master will strip you of favor and throw you into that kennel. You will fight where even demons fear to tread, and when you die it will be as ammunition, not as brothers. Others spun it differently. Among bitter warbands that had been used too often and rewarded too little, the Oathbroken were half admired. They were spoken of as martyrs to futility, warriors who understood that no amount of blood would ever buy back what the gods had taken, and so chose to spend their last strength in an act of spite that scarred whole stars, around under lit sacrificial pits, and within the command chambers of ships that had gone rogue from larger musters. Men in patched armor and eyes full of old grudges threw dice and argued. They were fools, one would say. They thought their defiance could matter to beings who see whole sectors as dust. They were right, another would answer. The gate died with them. There is a hole in the galaxy with their teeth marks around it. Tell me, that is nothing. No one knew the truth in full. That was the nature of the Eye. Facts were eaten and excreted as legend. Malith Zar's sacrifice became, in some tellings, a bid to seize the gate for himself and ascend, thwarted at the last. Rauk's last words were misquoted, misremembered, turned into curses or prayers depending on the teller. At the same time, rumors began to crawl through the warp like thin, persistent worms. On a demon world where the sky was a lid of ochre flesh, an Iron Warrior's gun line broke under an unexpected assault. Witnesses, those that survived, swore they saw a handful of black and gold figures limping through the fire, chain stumps whirling, heavy weapons bolted to mangled shoulders. They fought with suicidal ferocity, held a breach against an impossible tide of enemy machines, then vanished when the smoke cleared, leaving only a trail of warped footprints. On an orc scrap moon near the edge of some forgotten crusade, a slick of tyrannid biomass finally overran a Gargant yard. The mechs who escaped told wild tales of Humy tin boys, who arrived out of nowhere and started hacking at anything that moved, orc or bug, laughing like broken engines until a spore storm buried them. On a corpse world where the Imperium had long since written off all life, a lone commissar leading a last stand in the skeleton of a manufactorum saw a black shadow fight alongside his men for a while, its bolts taking heads that might have been Chaos, might have been his own. The figure left when the battle was lost, climbing into a shuttle that no one else saw. Were these true remnants, thrown clear when the gate imploded, dragged along strange currents until they washed up in new wars? Were they warped reflections, ghosts given temporary flesh by the warp's fondness for repeating its favorite jokes? Or were they simply other broken warbands dressing themselves in someone else's horror? No one could say. The warp did not answer questions in straight lines. What remained constant was the lesson. Chaos did not simply punish failure with death. Death was cheap. Mortals died by the million every hour of every day across the breadth of the Imperium and its enemies. A corpse was not a message. A corpse was just a stain. To truly punish, Chaos recycled. It took broken oaths and welded them into new chains. It took crippled bodies and bolted blades to their stumps. It took disgraced names and hammered them into threats that could be shown to others. The Oathbroken had been that threat in one incarnation. Even their attempt at rebellion, their effort to choose their own targets and cut their own path, had been swallowed. The dead zone they carved in the warp served the War Master's larger war. Their massacre of refugees, meant as their own declaration, became a cautionary tale told by Inquisitors to justify harsher measures, by Chaos Lords to justify crueler leashes. Nothing in that age escaped being turned to someone's purpose. Even defiance was just another weapon, if you held it by the right end. In the fortress monasteries of the Ordo Xenos, the Deathwatch read heavily redacted versions of the crippled warband's deeds. Their chaplains and watch captains used the story as another warning. "Know this," they said to their black-armored brothers, drawn from 100 chapters. "There are those in the darkness who look like you from a distance. There are those who have seen your methods and twisted them. You are not unique in being few, in being called to fight where others cannot. Your difference is your duty. Your leash is chosen, not welded." They spoke of the legends as an enemy mirror. Both the Deathwatch and the Oathbroken were small compared to the armies that moved around them. Both were sent where others would die. Both, in their own ways, changed the fates of campaigns far larger than their head counts should have allowed. The difference was in the oath. One brotherhood knelt to a dead emperor and swore to guard his realm against the alien, no matter the cost. The other was dragged before a living warmaster and told that the only way they would ever balance their ledger was by bleeding and bleeding and bleeding until nothing was left. On the Demon Forge world, where the Oathbroken had once been branded, hulks in their old configuration still orbited. Some were half disassembled, their hulls opened like the shells of beetles, their internal decks exposed to the void. Others were intact enough to board, their passageways echoing with the faint, glitching sounds of old orders and the recorded screams of ghosts that had not yet faded. Young black legionnaires were brought there as part of their hardening. Champions led them through the dim, cold corridors, pausing to kick at rusted chain housings and bent plates. "These were your betters once," a champion would say, voice transmitted on open channels so all could hear. Warriors who thought they could hide their failures, or who thought their personal glories mattered more than the crusade. The Warmaster did not simply kill them, he made them fight until their armor fell apart. He used them as a signpost. They would stop before a cracked helm, still bearing the twisted 8-pointed mark that had been burned into it so long ago. "Serve well," the champion would say, resting one gauntlet on the cold metal, "or you will join them. There is always room in the kennel for one more hound." Some of the machine spirits trapped in those hulks still whispered. They remembered chain-limbed warriors stomping down their decks, remembered the taste of Xeno's blood on their hulls, the feel of warp currents during impossible drops. They muttered in Binharik to any tech priest who listened too long, offering fragments of recorded oaths, corrupted now into nonsense that nonetheless carried an emotional weight. Another relic survived, in a different form. Somewhere in the transmission archives of a dozen Chaos fleets, a Vox fragment persisted. It had been copied and recopied, degraded and overlaid with other noise, but one line remained clear enough to catch the ear. "We are the hunt." The voice was rough, scarred by too many battles fought in ash-choked air. The resonance suggested Astartes' chest cavities behind the Vox grill. The tone carried no joy, only certainty. Among certain warbands, speaking those words became an unsanctioned rite. Warriors who knew they were tools, who had long since given up on promises of demonhood or thrones of skulls, muttered it before boarding actions, before impossible charges. It was a way of saying, we know what we are. We know who holds our leash. We choose to bite anyway. In the endless chronicle of the age, the Oathbroken barely merited mention. Scholars in hidden libraria, those few who might have pieced together a more complete picture, had 1,000 other horrors to consider. Campaigns that burned across whole segments of the galaxy demanded ink and memory. Demon Primarchs clawed their way from legend back into fact. Planets winked out like sparks in a gale. In that sliding ledger, one warband among tens of thousands, one more tale of traitors killing traitors and Imperials dying between them, hardly stood out. Their tally of billions dead was just another statistic in a millennium that had lost the ability to be shocked by such numbers. And yet, for the man whose lungs filled with virus rot in Sanctum Tal's death wind, for the stormtrooper crushed against the decking as Vorath used him to block a volley, for the pilgrim who looked up from the crowded hold of a refugee ship and saw a black and gold giant walking toward him with a bolter raised. The Oath Broken were not an anecdote. They were the edge of the universe, the last fact, the end. Perspective mattered little to the gods. It mattered entirely to the dead. Somewhere, on a nameless battlefield that had never earned a place on any map, a wind moved. It was a thin wind, whistling through the skeletons of hab blocks, knocked flat by some long-forgotten artillery exchange. Ash lay in drifts against crumpled walls. Spent casings glittered like old coins in the grey. Half buried in that ash was a pauldron. Black, trimmed in gold, a band of lapis circling its curve. The 8-pointed star at its centre had been twisted in on itself, its arms curled like broken fingers. Cracks ran through the enamel. Ichor long since dried to a dark stain crusted its edges. A boot scuffed the ash aside. A man stooped, the leather of his improvised armour creaking. He was nothing much in the scale of things, just another chaos cultist who had spent his short life scavenging battlefields for trinkets that might buy him a place in some warband's tale. His hand closed around the pauldron. Weight flooded up his arm. For an instant, the battlefield around him blurred. He saw a macro Hulk drifting in the eye. He saw a demon forge's pits, a brand descending. He saw Xenos swarms burning, traitor worlds shattering, a refugee fleet dying in the dark. He heard a voice, rough and implacable, say, "We are the hunt." His knees buckled. He clutched the pauldron to his chest, eyes wide, breath coming in ragged gasps. He did not understand what he was seeing. He did not know the name Oath Broken. All he knew was that this piece of armor, this cracked relic, held more hate than his entire scrawled little life. In the warp, somewhere just beyond the thin skin of reality over that nameless place, something old and bitter twitched. Not a god, not anything so grand. Just the lingering echo of oaths that had never been fully erased, the stubborn residue of 1,000 refusals to die quietly. It turned, like a predator smelling a scent it had not expected to encounter again. On the battlefield, the cultist straightened slowly, pauldron held tight, eyes shining with a new, ugly resolve. There are always more hunts, the echo seemed to say, and there are always hands willing to pick up a fallen mark and see if it still cuts.